Chapter 56 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 56. Something Forgotten. I will not trouble my reader with the thoughts that kept rising, flickering and fading one after another, for 2 or 3 dismal hours, as he lay with eyes closed but sleepless. At length he opened them wide, and looked out into the room. It was a bright moonlit night. The wind had sunk to rest. All the world slept in the exhaustion of the storm. He only was awake. He could lie no longer. He would go out and discover, if possible, the mischief the tempest had done. He crept down the little spiral stair used only by the servants, and knowing all the mysteries of lock and bar was presently in the open air. First he sought a view of the building against the sky, but could not see that any portion was missing. He then proceeded to walk round the house, in order to find what had fallen. There was a certain neglected spot nearly under his own window, where a wall across an interior angle formed a little court or yard. He had once peeped in at the door of it, which was always half open, and seemed incapable of being moved in either direction, but had seen nothing except a broken pail and a pile of brushwood. The flat arch over this door was broken, and the door itself half buried in a heap of blackened stones and mortar. Here was the avalanche whose fall had so terrified the household. The formless mass had yesterday been a fair-proportioned and ornate stack of chimneys. He scrambled to the top of the heap, and sitting down on a stone carved with a plated Celtic band, yet again fell a-thinking. The Marquis must dismiss him in the morning. Would it not be better to go away now, and spare poor old Duncan a terrible fit of rage? He would suppose he had fled from the pseudo-maternal net of Mrs. Stewart, and not till he had found a place to which he could welcome him would he tell him the truth. But his nature recoiled both from the unmanliness of such a flight, and from the appearance of conscious wrong it must involve, and he dismissed the notion. Scheme after scheme for the future passed through his head, and still he sat on the heap in the light of the high gliding moon, like a ghost on the ruins of his earthly home, and his eyes went listlessly straying like servants without a master. Suddenly he found them occupied with a low iron-studded door in the wall of the house, which he had never seen before. He descended, and found it hardly closed, for there was no notch to receive the heavy latch. Pushing it open on great rusty hinges, he saw within what in the shadow appeared a precipitous descent. His curiosity was roused. He stole back to his room and fetched his candle, and having by the aid of his tinder-box lighted it in the shelter of the heap, peeped again through the doorway, and saw what seemed a narrow cylindrical pit, only, far from showing a great yawning depth, it was filled with stones and rubbish nearly to the bottom of the door. The top of the door reached almost to the vaulted roof, one part of which, close to the inner side of the circular wall, was broken. Below this breach, fragments of stone projected from the wall, suggesting the remnants of a stair. With the sight came a foresight of discovery. 1 foot on the end of a long stone sticking vertically from the rubbish, and another on one of the stones projecting from the wall, his head was already through the break in the roof, and in a minute more he was climbing a small, broken, but quite passable spiral staircase, almost a counterpart of that already described as going like a huge auger-bore through the house from top to bottom, that indeed by which he had just descended. There was most likely more of it buried below, probably communicating with an outlet in some part of the rock towards the burn. But the portion of it which, from long neglect, had gradually given way, had fallen down the shaft, and cut off the rest with its ruins. At the height of a story he came upon a built-up doorway, and again at a similar height upon another. But the parts filled in looked almost as old as the rest of the wall. Not until he reached the top of the stair did he find a door. It was iron-studded and heavily hinged like that below. It opened outward, noiselessly he found, as if its hinges had been recently oiled, and admitted him to a small closet, the second door of which he opened hurriedly with a beating heart. Yes, there was the check-curtained bed. It must be the wizard's chamber. Crossing to another door, he found it both locked and further secured by a large iron bolt in a strong staple. This latter he drew back, but there was no key in the lock. With scarce a doubt remaining, he shot down the one stair and flew up the other to try the key that lay in his chest. One moment, and he stood in the same room, admitted by the door next his own. Some exposure was surely not far off. Anyhow, here was room for counterplot, on the chance of baffling something underhand, villainy most likely, where Mrs. Cattenaugh was concerned. And yet, with the control of it thus apparently given into his hands, he must depart, leaving the house at the mercy of a low woman, for the lock of the wizard's door would not exclude her long if she wished to enter and range the building. He would not go, however, without revealing all to the Marquis, and would at once make some provision towards her discomfiture. Going to the forge, and bringing thence a long bar of iron to use as a lever, he carefully drew from the door-frame the staple of the bolt, and then replaced it, so that, while it looked just as before, a good push would now send it into the middle of the room. Lastly, he slid the bolt into it, and having carefully removed all traces of disturbance, left the mysterious chamber by its own stair, and once more ascending to the passage, locked the door, and retired to his room with the key. He had now plenty to think about beyond himself. Here certainly was some small support to the legend of the wizard Earl. The stair which he had discovered had been in common use at one time. Its connection with other parts of the house had been cut off with an object, and by degrees it had come to be forgotten altogether. Many villainies might have been effected by means of it. Mrs. Cattenaugh must have discovered it the same night on which he found her there, had gone away by it then, and had certainly been making use of it since. When he smelt the sulphur, she must have been lighting a match. It was now getting towards morning, and at last he was tired. He went to bed and fell asleep. When he awoke, it was late, and as he dressed, he heard the noise of hoofs and wheels in the stable-yard. He was sitting at breakfast in Mrs. Courthope's room, when she came in full of surprise at the sudden departure of her lord and lady. The Marquis had rung for his man, and Lady Florimel for her maid, as soon as it was light. Orders were sent at once to the stable. 4 horses were put to the travelling carriage, and they were gone. Mrs. Courthope could not tell whither. Dreary as was the house without Florimel, things had turned out a shade or two better than Malcolm had expected, and he braced himself to endure his loss. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 57. The Laird's Quest. Things were going pretty well with the Laird. Phemie and he drew yet closer to each other, and as he became yet more peaceful in her company, his thoughts flowed more freely, and his utterance grew less embarrassed, until at length, in talking with her, his speech was rarely broken with even a slight impediment, and a stranger might have overheard a long conversation between them, without coming to any more disparaging conclusion in regard to him than that the hunchback was peculiar in mind as well as in body. But his nocturnal excursions continuing to cause her apprehension, and his representations of the delights to be gathered from nature while she slept, at the same time alluring her greatly, Phemie had become, both for her own pleasure and his protection, anxious in these also to be his companion. With a vital recognition of law, and great loyalty to any utterance of either parent, she had yet been brought up in an atmosphere of such liberty that, except a thing were expressly so conditioned, or in itself appeared questionable, she never dreamed of asking permission to do it. And accustomed as she had been to go with the Laird everywhere, and to be out with him early and late, her conscience never suggested the possibility of any objection to her getting up at 12 instead of 4 or 5 to accompany him. It was some time, however, before the Laird himself would consent, and then he would not unfrequently interpose with limitations, especially if the night were not mild and dry, sending her always home again to bed. The mutual rule and obedience between them was something at once strange and lovely. At midnight Phemy would enter the shop, and grope her way until she stood under the trap-door. This was the nearest she could come to the laird's chamber, for he had not only declined having the latter stand there for his use, but had drawn a solemn promise from the carpenter that at night it should always be left slung up to the joists. For himself he had made a rope-ladder, which he could lower from beneath when he required it, invariably drew up after him, and never used for coming down. One night Phemy made her customary signal by knocking against the trap-door with a long slip of wood. It opened, and as usual the body of the laird appeared, hung for a moment in the square gap, like a huge spider, by its 2 hands, one on each side, then dropped straight to the floor, when, without a word, he hastened forth, and Phemy followed. The night was very still, and rather dark, for it was cloudy about the horizon, and there was no moon. Hand in hand the two made for the shore, here very rocky, a succession of promontories with little coves between. Down into one of these they went by a winding path, and stood at the lip of the sea. A violet dimness, or rather a semi-transparent darkness, hung over it, through which came now and then a gleam, where the slow heave of some Triton's shoulder caught a shine of the sky. A hush also as of sleep hung over it, which, not to break, the wavelets of the rising tide carefully stilled their noises, and the dimness and the hush seemed one. They sat down on a rock that rose but a foot or 2 from the sand, and for some moments listened in silence to the inarticulate story of the night. At length the laird turned to Phemy, and taking one of her hands in both of his, very solemnly said, as if breaking to her his life's trouble, "Phemy, I dinna ken where I come frae." "Hoot, laird, ye ken well enough ye came frae God," answered Phemy, lengthening out the word with solemn utterance. The laird did not reply, and again the night closed around them, and the sea hushed at their hearts. But a soft light air began to breathe from the south, and it waked the laird to more active thought. "Gin he would but come out and shaw himsel'," he said. "What for disna he come out?" "Who would ye hae come out?" asked Phemy. "Ye ken who well enough. They say he's all gate at once. Just hearken. What for will he aye bide in, and never come out, and a poor body see him?" The speech was broken into pauses, filled by the hush rather than noise of the tide, and the odour-like wandering of the soft air in the convolutions of their ears. "The lone wind maun be his breath. Sae quiet. He's no hurrying himsel' the night. There's never nobody runs after him. Eh, Phemy? I just thought he was going to speak." This last exclamation he uttered in a whisper, as the louder gush of a larger tide pulse died away on the shore. "Look, Phemy, look," he resumed. "Look out yonner. Dinna ye see something that might grow to something?" His eyes were fixed on a faint spot of steely blue out on the sea, not far from the horizon. It was hard to account for with such a sky overhead, wherein was no lighter part to be seen that might be reflected in the water below. But neither of the beholders was troubled about its cause. There it glimmered on in the dimness of the wide night, a cold, faint splash of blue-grey. "I dinna think muckle o' that, sir," said Phemy. "It might be the mark o' the sole of his foot, though," returned the laird. "He might ha' just sitten it down, and the water ha' lowed up about it, and the low not be willin' to gang out. Look sharp, Phemy. There may come anither at the next stride, another footmark. Look ye that gate, and I'll look this. What for willna he come out? The lift maun be full o' him, and I'm hungert for a sight o' him. Can ye see onything, Phemy? Cry out." "What will I cry?" asked Phemy. "Cry, 'Father o' Lights,'" answered the laird. "Will he hear to that?" Do you think, sir?
Who kens? He might just turn his head, and one look would serve me for 100 year.
I sa cry, gin I see anything, said Phemy. As they sat watching, by degrees the laird's thoughts swerved a little. His gaze had fixed on the northern horizon, where, as if on the outer threshold of some mighty door, long, low clouds, with varied suggestion of recumbent animal forms, had stretched themselves like creatures of the chase, watching for their lord to issue.
Maybe he's not out of the house yet, he said. Surely it cannot be but he comes out ilka night. He would never have made sic a sight of bonny things to let them lie without anybody to gather them. And there's not ill folk the forth of this time o' night to make an ugly din or disturb him with the sight of them. He maun come out in the quiet of the night, or else what's it all for? Aye, he keeps the night till himsel', and leaves the day to us. That'll be what the deep sleep falls upon men for, doubtless, to hold them out o' his gate. I wuss he would come out when I was by. I might get a glimp o' him. Maybe he would take the hump off o' me, and set things in order in my head, and make me like ither folk. Me, that would be gran. Nobody would dare to touch me syne. Mighty, come out, feather o' lights, feather o' lights.
He went on repeating the words, till, growing softer and softer, his voice died away in silence, and still as his seat of stone he sat, a new Job, on the verge of the world waters, like the old Job on his dunghill, when he cried out, Lo, he goeth by me, and I see him not. He passeth on also, but I perceive him not. Call thou, and I will answer, or let me speak, and answer thou me. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. At length he rose, and wandered away from the shore, his head sunk upon his chest. Phemy rose also, and followed him in silence. The child had little of the poetic element in her nature, but she had much of that from which everything else has to be developed, heart. When they reached the top of the brae, she joined him, and said, putting her hand in his, but not looking at, or even turning towards him, Maybe he'll come out upon ye afore ye ken some day, when you're not looking for him. The laird stopped, gazed at her for a moment, shook his head, and walked on. Grassy steeps everywhere met the stones and sands of the shore, and the grass and the sand melted, as it were, and vanished each in the other. Just where they met in the next hollow stood a small building of stone with a tiled roof. It was now strangely visible through the darkness, for from every crevice a fire-illumined smoke was pouring. But the companions were not alarmed, or even surprised. They bent their way towards it without hastening a step, and coming to a fence that enclosed a space around it, opened a little gate, and passed through. A sleepy watchman challenged them. "It's me," said the laird. "A fine night, laird," returned the voice, and said no more. The building was divided into several compartments, each with a separate entrance. On the ground in each burned 4 or 5 little wood fires, and the place was filled with smoke and glow. The smoke escaped partly by openings above the doors, but mostly by the crannies of the tiled roof. Ere it reached these, however, it had to pass through a great multitude of pendant herrings. Hung up by the gills, layer above layer, nearly to the roof, their last tails came down as low as the laird's head. From beneath nothing was to be seen but a firmament of herring tails. These fish were the last of the season, and were thus undergoing the process of kippering. It was a new venture in the place, and its success as yet a question. The laird went into one of the compartments, and searching about a little amongst the multitude within his reach, took down a plump one, then cleared away the blazing wood from the top of one of the fires, and laid his choice upon the glowing embers beneath.
"What are you doing there, Laird?" cried Feemy from without, whose nostrils the resulting odour had quickly reached. "The fish is not yours." "You didn't think I would take it wanting leave, Feemy," returned the laird. "Mony a supper hae I made this way, and mony another I hope to make. It'll no be this season, though, for this lot's the last of them. They're fine eating, but I'm some feart they winna keep." "Who gave you leave, sir?" persisted Feemy, showing herself the indevertible guardian of his morals as well as of his freedom. "Oh, Mr. Runcie himsel', of course," answered the laird. "Will I put ane on to you?" "Did ye speir leave for me too?" asked the righteous maiden. "Oh, na, but I'll tell him the next time I see him." "I'm na for any," said Feemy. The fish wanted little cooking. The laird turned it, and after another half-minute of the fire, took it up by the tail, sat down on a stone beside the door, spread a piece of paper on his knees, laid the fish upon it, pulled a lump of bread from his pocket, and proceeded to make his supper. Ere he began, however, he gazed all around with a look which Feemy interpreted as a renewed search for the Father of Lights, whom he would fain thank for his gifts. When he had finished, he threw the remnants into one of the fires, then went down to the sea, and there washed his face and hands in a rock pool, after which they set off again, straying yet further along the coast. One of the peculiarities in the friendship of the strange couple was, that although so closely attached, they should maintain such a large amount of mutual independence. They never quarrelled, but would flatly disagree, with never an attempt at compromise. The whole space between midnight and morning would sometimes glide by without a word spoken between them, and the one or the other would often be lingering far behind. As, however, the ultimate goal of the night's wandering was always understood between them, there was little danger of their losing each other. On the present occasion, the laird, still full of his quest, was the one who lingered. Every few minutes he would stop and stare, now all around the horizon, now up to the zenith, now over the wastes of sky. For any moment, from any spot in heaven, earth, or sea, the Father of Lights might show foot or hand or face. He had at length seated himself on a lichen-covered stone with his head buried in his hands, as if, wearied with vain search for him outside, he would now look within and see if God might not be there, when suddenly a sharp exclamation from Feemy reached him. He listened. "Run! Run! Run!" she cried, the last word prolonged into a scream. While it yet rang in his ears, the laird was half-way down the steep. In the open country he had not a chance, but knowing every cranny in the rocks large enough to hide him, with anything like a start near enough to the shore for his short-lived speed, he was all but certain to evade his pursuers, especially in such a dark night as this. He was not in the least anxious about Feemy, never imagining she might be less sacred in other eyes than in his, and knowing neither that her last cry of loving solitude had gathered intensity from a cruel grasp, nor that while he fled in safety, she remained a captive. Trembling and panting like a hare just escaped from the hounds, he squeezed himself into a cleft, where he sat half covered with water until the morning began to break. Then he drew himself out and crept along the shore from point to point, with keen circumspection, until he was right under the village and within hearing of its inhabitants, when he ascended hurriedly and ran home. But having reached his burrow, pulled down his rope ladder and ascended, he found, with troubled dismay, that his loft had been invaded during the night. Several of the hooked cords had been cut away, on one or two were shreds of clothing, and on the window-sill was a drop of blood. He threw himself on the mound for a moment, then started to his feet, caught up his plaid, tumbled from the loft, and fled from Scournos, as if a visible pestilence had been behind him. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 58. Malcolm and Mrs. Stewart.
When her parents discovered that Phemy was not in her garret, it occasioned them no anxiety. When they had also discovered that neither was the laird in his loft, and were naturally seized with the dread that some evil had befallen him, his hitherto invariable habit having been to house himself with the first gleam of returning day, they supposed that Phemy, finding he had not returned, had set out to look for him. As the day wore on, however, without her appearing, they began to be a little uneasy about her as well. Still, the two might be together, and the explanation of their absence a very simple and satisfactory one. For a time, therefore, they refused to admit importunate disquiet. But before night, anxiety, like the slow but persistent waters of a flood, had insinuated itself through their whole being, nor theirs alone, but had so mastered and possessed the whole village, that at length all employment was deserted, and every person capable joined in a search along the coast, fearing to find their bodies at the foot of some cliff. The report spread to the neighbouring villages. In Port Lossie, Duncan went round with his pipes, arousing attention by a brief blast, and then crying the loss at every corner. As soon as Malcolm heard of it, he hurried to find Joseph, but the only explanation of their absence he was prepared to suggest was one that had already occurred to almost everybody, that the laird, namely, had been captured by the emissaries of his mother, and that, to provide against a rescue, they had carried off his companion with him. On which supposition, there was every probability that, within a few days at farthest, Phemy would be restored unhurt.
"There can be little doubt they ha' gotten a grip o' him at last, poor fellow," said Joseph. "But whatever's come till him, we canna sit down and ate our meat unkent how Phemy's faring, poor wee lamb. Ye maun just hold away o'er to Kirkbyres, Malcolm, and get word o' your mither, and see gin onything can be made out o' her."
The proposal fell on Malcolm like a great billow.
"Blue Peter," he said, looking him in the face, "I took it as a mark o' your friendship that ye never spake the word to me. What right has any man to call that woman my mither? I ha' never allowed it."
"I'm thinking," returned Joseph, the more easily nettled that his horizon also was full of trouble,
"your word upon the matter will na gang so far as John o' Groat's. Ye'll no be so peent for your witness upon the pint." "I would as soon gang a mile into the mouth o' hell as gang to Kirkbyres," said Malcolm. "I hae my answer," said Peter,
and turned away.
"But I sa gang," Malcolm went on. "The thing 'at maun be can be. Only I tell ye this, Peter," he added, "gin ever ye say sic a word as yon in my hearing again, that is, afore the woman has proven hersel what she says, I sa gang by ye ever after unspoken, for I'll ken 'at ye want nae mair o' me."
Joseph, who had been standing with his back to his friend, turned and held out his hand. Malcolm took it.
"A question afore I gang, Peter," he said. "What for dinna ye tell me what folk was sayin' about me, anent Lizzie Findlay?"
"'Cause I dinna believe a word o' it, and I wasna gaein' to add to your troubles."
"Lizzie never mooted sic a thing?" "Never." "I was sure o' that. Noo I'll awa' to Kirkbyres, God help me. I would rather face Sawtan an' his muckle tyke. But dinna ye expec ony news. Gin yon one kens, she's all the surer not to tell. Only ye sannot say I didna do my best for ye."
It was the hardest trial of the will Malcolm had yet had to encounter. Trials of submission he had had, and tolerably severe ones. But to go and do what the whole feeling recoils from, is to be weighed only against abstinence from what the whole feeling urges towards. He walked determinedly home. Stoat saddled a horse for him while he changed his dress, and once more he set out for Kirkbyres. Had Malcolm been at the time capable of attempting an analysis of his feeling towards Mrs. Stewart, he would have found it very difficult to effect. Satisfied as he was of the untruthful, even cruel nature of the woman who claimed him, and conscious of a strong repugnance to any nearer approach between them, he was yet aware of a certain indescribable fascination in her. This, however, only caused him to recoil from her the more, partly from dread lest it might spring from the relation asserted, and partly that, whatever might be its root, it wrought upon him in a manner he scarcely disliked the less that it certainly had nothing to do with the filial. But his feelings were too many and too active to admit of the analysis of any one of them, and ere he reached the house his mood had grown fierce. He was shown into a room where the fire had not been many minutes lighted. It had long, narrow windows, over which the ivy had grown so thick that he was in it some moments ere he saw through the dusk that it was a library. Not half the size of that at Lossie House, but far more ancient, and, although evidently neglected, more study-like. A few minutes passed, then the door softly opened, and Mrs. Stewart glided swiftly across the floor with outstretched arms. "At last!" she said, and would have clasped him to her bosom. But Malcolm stepped back.
"Na, na, mem," he said. "It takes two to that."
"Malcolm!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion, of some kind.
"Ye may call me your son, mem, but I ken na ground yet for calling you my—"
He could not say the word. "That is very true, Malcolm," she returned gently. "But this interview is not of my seeking. I wish to precipitate nothing. So long as there is a single link, or half a link even, missing from the chain of which one end hangs at my heart." She paused, with her hand on her bosom, apparently to suppress rising emotion. Had she had the sentence ready for use? "I will not subject myself," she went on, "to such treatment as it seems I must look for from you. It is hard to lose a son, but it is harder yet to find him again after he has utterly ceased to be one." Here she put her handkerchief to her eyes. "Till the matter is settled, however," she resumed, "let us be friends, or at least not enemies. What did you come for now? Not to insult me, surely. Is there anything I can do for you?" Malcolm felt the dignity of her behaviour, but not the less, after his own straightforward manner, answered her question to the point.
"I came about nothing concerning mysel, mem. I came to see whether ye kent anything about Feemy Mair."
"Is it a what? I don't even know who she is. You don't mean the young woman that— Why do you come to me about her? Who is she?" Malcolm hesitated a moment. If she really did not know what he meant, was there any risk in telling her? But he saw none.
"Who is she, mem?" he returned. "I whiles think she maun be the laird's good angel, though in shape she's but a wee bit lassie. She makes up for a heap to the laird. Him and her, mem, they've disappeared together. Nobody kens whaur."
Mrs. Stewart laughed, a low, unpleasant laugh, but made no other reply. Malcolm went on.
"And it's no to be wondered at, gin folk will hae it ye maun ken something about it, mem."
"I know nothing whatever," she returned emphatically. "Believe me or not, as you please," she added with heightened colour. "If I did know anything," she went on with apparent truthfulness, "I don't know that I should feel bound to tell it. As it is, however, I can only say I know nothing of either of them. That I do say most solemnly." Malcolm turned, satisfied at least that he could learn no more. "You are not going to leave me so," the lady said, and her face grew sad as sad could be.
"There's nothing mair atween us, mem," answered Malcolm,
without turning even his face. "You will be sorry for treating me so some day."
"Well then, mem, I will be. But that day's not the day."
"Think what you could do for your poor witless brother if—"
"Mem," interrupted Malcolm, turning right round and drawing himself up in anger. "Prove it I'm your son, and that minute I speir at you who is my father."
Mrs. Stewart changed colour. Neither with the blush of innocence, nor with the pallor of guilt, but with the grey of mingled rage and hatred. She took a step forward with the quick movement of a snake about to strike, but stopped midway, and stood looking at him with glittering eyes, teeth clenched, and lips half open. Malcolm returned her gaze for a moment or two.
"Ye never was the mither, whoever was the father o' me," he said, and walked out of the room.
He had scarcely reached the door when he heard a heavy fall, and looking round, saw the lady lying motionless on the floor. Thoroughly on his guard, however, and fearful both of her hatred and her blandishments, he only made the more haste downstairs, where he found a maid and sent her to attend to her mistress. In a minute he was mounted and trotting fast home, considerably happier than before, inasmuch as he was now almost beyond doubt convinced that Mrs. Stewart was not his mother. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 59, An Honest Plot. Ever since the visit of condolence with which the narrative of these events opened, there had been a coolness between Mrs. Mellis and Miss Horne. Mr. Mellis's shop was directly opposite Miss Horne's house, and his wife's parlour was over the shop, looking into the street. Hence the two neighbours could not but see each other pretty often. Beyond a stiff nod, however, no sign of smouldering friendship had as yet broken out. Miss Horne was consequently a good deal surprised when, having gone into the shop to buy some trifle, Mr. Mellis informed her, in all but a whisper, that his wife was very anxious to see her alone for a moment, and begged her to have the goodness to step up to the parlour. His customer gave a small snort, betraying her first impulse to resentment, but her nobler nature, which was never far from the surface, constrained her compliance. Mrs. Mellis rose hurriedly when the plumb-line figure of her neighbour appeared, ushered in by her husband, and received her with a somewhat embarrassed empressement, arising from the consciousness of goodwill, disturbed by the fear of imputed meddlesomeness. She knew the inward justice of Miss Horne, however, and relied upon that, even while she encouraged herself by waking up the ever-present conviction of her own superiority in the petite morale of social intercourse. Her general tendency, indeed, was to look down upon Miss Horne. Is it not usually the less that looks down on the greater? I had almost said it must be, for that the less only can look down, but that would not hold absolutely in the kingdoms of this world, while in the kingdom of heaven it is all looking up. "Sit ye down, Miss Horne," she said. "It's a long time sin' we had a news together." Miss Horne seated herself with a begrudged acquiescence. Had Mrs. Mellis been more of a tactician, she would have dug a few approaches ere she opened fire upon the fortress of her companion's fair hearing. But instead of that, she at once discharged the imprudent question. "Was ye at home last night, mem, atween the hours of 8 and 9? A shot which instantly awoke in reply the whole battery of Miss Horne's indignation. "Who am I to be speered sic a question? Who but yoursel would have dared it, Mistress Mellis?" "Holy, holy, Miss Horne," expostulated her questioner. "I had no wish to pry into any secrets of yours, or—" "Secrets!" shouted Miss Horne. But her consciousness of good intent, and all but assurance of final victory, upheld Mrs. Mellis. "Or James either," she went on, apparently regardless. "But I would fain be sure ye kent all about your ain house 'at a body might chance to see frae the crown o' the causey." Middle of the street. "The parlour blind's gone up crooked ever sin' that thumb-fingered cratur Watty Witherspale made a new roller till it. Can it be that ye mean, Mistress Mellis?" "Hoots!" returned the other. "How far can ye lip into that jean o' yours, mem?" "Na farrer nor the length o' my nose, and the braid o' my toe een," was the scornful answer. Although, however, she thus manifested her resentment of Mrs. Mellis's catechetical attempts at introducing her subject, Miss Horne had no desire to prevent the free outcome of her approaching communication. "In that case I may spake out," said Mrs. Mellis. "Use your freedom." "Well, I will. Ye was hardly out o' the house last night afore—" "Ye saw me gang out?" "Ay, did I." "What garred ye speer then? What for sud a body come screwin' up a straight stair? No the face and no the back o' her." "Well, I not know how I speered, but that's nothing to the point. Ye hadna been gone, as I was saying, ower 5 minutes, when in came a licht into the bedroom nearest the parlour, and Jean appeared with a candle in her hand. There was nae light in this room but the light of the fire, and no muckle o' that, for 'twas mostly peat, so I saw her weel enough, unbeing seen mysel'. She came straight to the window, and drew down the blind, but lost hersel' a bit, or she would never have set down her candle where it cast a shadow o' hersel' and her doings upon the blind." "And what was she after, the jade?" cried Miss Horne, without any attempt to conceal her growing interest. "She made nothing o' it, whatever it was, for down the street came the schoolmaster, and chappit at the door, and gaed in and waited till ye came hame." "Well?" said Miss Horne. But Mrs. Mellis held her peace. "Well?" repeated Miss Horne. "Well," returned Mrs. Mellis, with a curious mixture of deference and conscious sagacity in her tone,
Aught I take upon me to say is, think ye twice afore ye lip into that Jean o' yours. I lip in nothing till her. I would as soon lip into the dirtle o' a pipe among dry straw. What saw ye, Mistress Mellis?" "You need not speak like that," returned Mrs. Mellis, for Miss Horne's tone was threatening. "I'm no Jane." "What saw ye?" repeated Miss Horne, more gently, but not less eagerly. "Whose is that kist o' mahogany drawers in that bedroom? Can I may presume to speir?" "Whose but mine?" "They're not Jean's?" "Jean's?" "You might ha' letten her keep her bit duds in them, for anything I kent." "Jean's duds in my Grizel's drawers! A likely thing." They were poor Miss Campbell's, were they?"
"They were Grizel Campbell's drawers as long as she had use for any. But what for ye sud say poor till her I dinna ken, 'cept it be 'at she's gone where they haena muckle 'at needs layin' in drawers. That's neither here nor there. Div ye tell me 'at Jean was intromittin' wi' the drawers? They're all locked, ilk one o' them, and they're good locks."
"No o'er good to have keys to them, are they?"
"The keys are in my pouch," said Miss Horne, clapping her hand to the skirt of her dress. "They're aye in my pouch, though I haena had the feelings to make use o' them sin she left me."
"Are you sure they were there last night, Mem?"
Miss Horne seemed struck.
"I had on my black silk last night,"
she answered vaguely, and was here silent, pondering doubtfully.
"Well, Mem, jist ye put on your black silk again the morn's night, and come ower about 8 o'clock, and ye'll be able to judge by her ongang when ye're not in the house, gin there be onything amiss wi' Jean."
"There canna be muckle ill done yet, that's a comfort."
"What ill,
by meddlin' wi' what does not concern her, could the woman do?" said Miss Horne, with attempted confidence.
"That ye should ken best yoursel, Mem. But Jean's an awful gossip, and a lady like your cousin might ha' left documents ahind her that she wouldna just like to hear proclaimed frae the housetop. Not she'll ever hear anything mair, poor thing."
"What mean ye?" cried Miss Horne, half frightened, half angry.
"Just what I say, neither mair nor less," returned Mrs. Mellis. "Miss Campbell may weel ha' left letters, for instance, and hoo would they fare in Jane's hands?"
"When I never had the heart to open her drawers!" exclaimed Miss Horne, enraged at the very notion of the crime. "I hae nae feelings, thank God for the furnishin' of me."
"I doubt Jean has her full share o' all feelin's belongin' to fallen human natur'," said Mrs. Mellis, with a slow horizontal oscillation of the head. "But ye just come and see with your ain een, and syne judge for yoursel'. It's no business o' mine."
"I'll come the nicht, Mrs. Mellis. Only let it be atween us two."
"I can hold my tongue, Mem. That is, frae all but one. So long as married folk sleeps in ae bed, it's ill to hold onything till a body's sel."
"Mr. Mellis is a douce man, and I care not what he kens," answered Miss Horne. She descended to the shop, and having bought bulk enough to account to Jean for her lengthened stay, for she had beyond a doubt been watching the door of the shop, she crossed the street, went up to her parlour, and rang the bell. The same moment Jean's head was popped in at the door. She had her reasons for always answering the bell like a bullet. "Mem," said Jean. "Jean, I'm gaein' out the nicht. The minister ought to be spoken till about the schoolmaster, honest man. Take the lantern with ye to the manse about 10 o'clock. That'll be time enough." "Verra weel, Mem, but I'm thinkin' there's a moon the nicht." "Naething but the doup o' ane, Jean. It's no to call a moon. It's a mercy we hae lanterns, and sic a sight o' cairds about. Gypsies." "Aye, lantern lets them see where ye are, and hold out your gate," said Jean, who happened not to relish going out that night. "Truth, woman, ye're right there," returned her mistress, with cheerful assent. "The mair they see o' ye, the less they'll meddle wi' ye, caird or cadger. Hold ye the light upon your ain face, lass, and there's few'll hae the heart to look again." "Haith, Mem, there's two sic like o' us," returned Jean bitterly, and bounced from the room. "That's true too," said her mistress, adding after the door was shut, "It's a pity we couldna hold on thegither." "I'm goin' now, Jean," she called into the kitchen as she crossed the threshold at 8 o'clock. She turned towards the head of the street in the direction of the manse, but out of the range of Jean's vision, made a circuit, and entered Mr. Mellis's house by the garden at the back. In the parlour she found a supper prepared to celebrate the renewal of old goodwill. The clear crystal on the table, The new loaf, so brown without and so white within, the rich, clear-complexioned butter, undebased with a particle of salt, the self-satisfied hum of the kettle in attendance for the goodman's toddy, the bright fire, the golden glow of the brass fender in its red light, and the dish of boiled potatoes set down before it under a snowy cloth, the pink eggs, the yellow haddock, and the crimson strawberry jam, all combined their influences, each with its private pleasure wondrously heightened by the zest of a secret watch and the hope of discomfited mischief, to draw into a friendship what had hitherto been but a somewhat insecure neighbourship. From below came the sound of the shutters which Mr. Mellis was putting up a few minutes earlier than usual, and when presently they sat down to the table, and after prologue judged suitable, proceeded to enjoy the good things before them, an outside observer would have thought they had a pleasant evening, if not Time himself by the forelock. But Miss Horne was uneasy. The thought of what Jean might have already discovered had haunted her all day long. For her reluctance to open her cousin's drawers had arisen mainly from the dread of finding justified a certain painful suspicion which had haunted the whole of her intercourse with Grizel Campbell. Namely, that the worm of a secret had been lying at the root of her life, the cause of all her illness, and of her death at last. She had fought with, out-argued, and banished the suspicion 1,000 times while she was with her. But evermore it had returned, and now since her death, when again and again on the point of turning over her things, she had been always deterred by the fear, not so much of finding what would pain herself, as of discovering what Grizel would not wish her to know. Never was there a greater contrast between form and reality, between person and being, between manner and nature than existed in Margaret Horne. The shell was rough, the kernel absolute delicacy. Not for a moment had her suspicion altered her behaviour to the gentle, suffering creature, towards whom she had adopted the relation of an elder and stronger sister. To herself, when most satisfied of the existence of a secret, she steadily excused her cousin's withholdment of confidence, on the ground of her own lack of feelings. How could she unbosom herself to such as she? And now the thought of eyes like Jean's, exploring Grizel's forsaken treasures, made her so indignant and restless that she could hardly even pretend to enjoy her friend's hospitality. Mrs. Mellis had so arranged the table and their places that she and her guest had only to lift their eyes to see the window of their watch, while she punished her husband for the virile claim to greater freedom from curiosity by seating him with his back to it, which made him every now and then cast a fidgety look over his shoulder, not greatly to the detriment of his supper, however. Their plan was to extinguish their own the moment Jean's light should appear, and so watch without the risk of counter-discovery. "There she comes!" cried Mrs. Mellis, and her husband and Miss Horne made such haste to blow out the candle that they knocked their heads together, blew in each other's faces, and the first time missed it. Jean approached the window with hers in her hand, and pulled down the blind. But alas, beyond the form of a close-bent elbow moving now and then across a corner of the white field, no shadow appeared upon it. Miss Horne rose. "Sit down, mem, sit down. Ye ha' nothing to gang upon yet," exclaimed Mr. Mellis, who, being a Bailey, was an authority. "I can sit nae longer, Mr. Mellis," returned Miss Horne. "I hae enough to gang upon as long as I hae my ain floor aneath my feet. The woman has nae business there. I'll just slip across and gang in as quiet as a soul intil a body, but I'se warrant I'se make a din afore I come out again." With a grim diagonal nod she left the room. Although it was now quite dark, she yet deemed it prudent to go by the garden gate into the back lane, and so cross the street lower down. Opening her own door noiselessly, thanks to Jean, who kept the lock well oiled, for reasons of Mrs. Cattenaugh's, she closed it as silently, and long-boned as she was, crept up the stair like a cat. The light was shining from the room. The door was ajar. She listened at it for a moment, and could distinguish nothing. Then, fancying she heard the rustle of paper, could bear it no longer, pushed the door open, and entered. There stood Jean, staring at her with fear-blanched face, a deep top-drawer open before her, and her hands full of things she was in the act of replacing. Her terror culminated, and its spell broke in a shriek, when her mistress sprang upon her like a tigress. The watchers in the opposite house heard no cry, and only saw a heave of 2 intermingled black shadows across the blind, after which they neither heard nor saw anything more. The light went on burning until its final struggle with the darkness began, when it died with many a flickering throb. Unable at last to endure the suspense, now growing to fear, any longer, they stole across the street, opened the door, and went in. Over the kitchen fire, like an evil spirit of the squabby order, crouched Mrs. Catanagh, waiting for Jean. No one else was to be found. About 10 o'clock the same evening, as Mr. Graham sat by his peat fire, someone lifted the latch of the outer door and knocked at the inner. His invitation to enter was answered by the appearance of Miss Horne, gaunt and grim as usual, but with more than the wonted fire gleaming from the shadowy cavern of her bonnet. She made no apology for the lateness of her visit, but seated herself at the other side of the deal table, and laid upon it a paper parcel, which she proceeded to open with much deliberation and suppressed plenitude. Having at length untied the string with the long fingers of a hand which, notwithstanding its evident strength, trembled so as almost to defeat the attempt, she took from the parcel a packet of old letters sealed with spangled wax, and pushed it across the table to the schoolmaster, saying, "Hey, Sandy Graham, nobody but yoursel has a right to say what's to be done with them." He put out his hand and took them gently, with a look of sadness, but no surprise. "Dinna think I ha' been reading them, Sandy Graham. Na, na. I would read nae honest man's letters, be they written to whom they might." Mr. Graham was silent. "You're a good man, Sandy Graham," Miss Horne resumed, "gin God ever took the pains to make one. Dinna think anything atween you and her would ha' brought me at this time o' night to disturb ye in your ain chamber. Na, na. Whatever was atween you two had an honest man intil it, and I would ha' ta'en my time to gie ye back your documents. But there's some of another mark here." As she spoke, she drew from the parcel a small cardboard box, broken at the sides, and tied with a bit of tape. This she undid, and turning the box upside down, tumbled its contents out on the table before him. "What make ye as sick like as that?" she said. "Do you want me to—" asked the schoolmaster with trembling voice. "I just do," she answered. They were a number of little notes, some of them but a word or two, and signed with initials, others longer and signed in full. Mr. Graham took up one of them reluctantly, and unfolded it softly. He had hardly looked at it, when he started, and exclaimed, "God have mercy! What can be the date of this?" There was no date to it. He held it in his hand for a minute, his eyes fixed on the fire, and his features almost convulsed with his efforts at composure. Then laid it gently on the table, and said, but without turning his eyes to Miss Horne, "I cannot read this. You must not ask me. It refers doubtless to the time when Miss Campbell was governess to Lady Annabel. I see no end to be answered by my reading one of these letters." "I daur say, whoever saw it would not look," returned Miss Horne, with a glance keen as an eagle's into the thoughtful eyes of her friend. "Why not do by the writer of these as you have done by me? Why not take them to him?" suggested Mr. Graham. "That would be but thumb-fingered work, to let gang the end o' your hank," exclaimed Miss Horne. "I do not understand you, ma'am." "Weel, I'm on guard ye understand me. There's things whiles, Sandy Graham, it's no easy to speyk about, but I hae nae feelings, and we'll all be dead or lang, and that's a comfort. Man 'at ye are, ye're the only human bein' I would open my mou' till about this matter, and that's 'cause ye lo'e the memory o' my poor lassie, Grizel Cammel." "It is not her memory, it is herself I love," said the schoolmaster with trembling voice. "Tell me what you please. You may trust me." "Gin I needed you to tell me that, I would trust ye as I would the black dog with butter. Hearken, Sandy Graham." The result of her communication and their following conference was, that she returned about midnight with a journey before her, the object of which was to place the letters in the safe keeping of a lawyer friend in the neighbouring county town. Long before she reached home, Mrs. Cattenaugh had left, not without communication with her ally, in spite of a certain precaution adopted by her mistress, the first thing the latter did when she entered being to take the key of the cellar stairs from her pocket and release Jean, who issued crestfallen and miserable, and was sternly dismissed to bed. The next day, however, for reasons of her own, Miss Horne permitted her to resume her duties about the house without remark, as if nothing had happened serious enough to render further measures necessary. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 60. The Sacrament. Abandoning all her remaining effects to Jean's curiosity, if indeed it were no worse demon that possessed her, Miss Horne, carrying a large reticule, betook herself to the Lossie Arms, to await the arrival of the mail coach from the west, on which she was pretty sure of a vacant seat. It was a still, frosty, finger-pinching dawn, and the rime lay thick wherever it could lie. But Miss Horne's red nose was carried in front of her in a manner that suggested nothing but defiance to the fiercest attacks of cold. Declining the offered shelter of the landlady's parlour, she planted herself on the steps of the inn, and there stood until the sound of the guard's horn came crackling through the frosty air, heralding the apparition of a flaming chariot fit for the sun-god himself, who was now lifting his red radiance above the horizon. Having none inside, the guard gallantly offered his one lady passenger a place in the heart of his vehicle, but she declined the attention. To him on the ground of preferring the outside, for herself on the ground of uncertainty whether he had a right to bestow the privilege. But there was such a fire in her heart that no frost could chill her, such a bright bow in her west that the sun now rising in the world's east was but a reflex of its splendour. True, the cloud against which it glowed was very dark with bygone wrong and suffering, but so much the more brilliant seemed the hope now arching the entrance of the future. Still, although she never felt the cold, and the journey was but of a few miles, it seemed long and wearisome to her active spirit, which would gladly have sent her tall person striding along, to relieve both by the discharge of the excessive generation of muscle-working electricity. At length the coach drove into the town, and stopped at the Duff Arms. Miss Horne descended, straightened her long back with some difficulty, shook her feet, loosened her knees, and after a douceur to the guard more liberal than was customary, in acknowledgment of the kindness she had been unable to accept, marched off with the stride of a grenadier to find her lawyer. Their interview did not relieve her of much of the time, which now hung upon her like a cloak of lead, and the earliness of the hour would not have deterred her from at once commencing a round of visits to the friends she had in the place. But the gates of the lovely environs of Fife House stood open, and although there were no flowers now, and the trees were leafless, waiting in poverty and patience for their coming riches, they drew her with the offer of a plentiful loneliness and room. She accepted it, entered, and for 2 hours wandered about their woods and walks. Entering with her the well-known domain, the thought meets me, what would be the effect on us men of such a periodical alternation between nothing and abundance as these woods undergo? Perhaps in the endless variety of worlds, there may be one in which that is among the means whereby its dwellers are saved from self and lifted into life. A world in which, during the one half of the year, they walk in state, in splendour, in bounty, and during the other are plunged in penury and labour. Such speculations were not in Miss Horne's way, but she was better than the loftiest of speculations, and we will follow her. By and by she came out of the woods, and found herself on the banks of the Wan Water, a broad, fine river, here talking in wide-rippled innocence from bank to bank, there lying silent and motionless and gloomy, as if all the secrets of the drowned, since the creation of the world, lay dim floating in its shadowy bosom. In great sweeps it sought the ocean, and the trees stood back from its borders, leaving a broad margin of grass between, as if the better to see it go. Just outside the grounds, and before reaching the sea, it passed under a long bridge of many arches. Then, trees and grass and flowers and all greenery left behind, rushed through a waste of storm-heaped pebbles into the world water. Miss Horne followed it out of the grounds and on to the beach. Here its channel was constantly changing. Even while she stood gazing at its rapid rush, its bank of pebbles and sand fell almost from under her feet. But her thoughts were so busy that she scarcely observed even what she saw, and hence it was not strange that she should be unaware of having been followed and watched all the way. Now from behind a tree, now from a corner of the mausoleum, now from behind a rock, now over the parapet of the bridge, the mad Laird had watched her. From a heap of shingle on the opposite side of the wan water, he was watching her now. Again and again he had made a sudden movement as if to run and accost her, but had always drawn back again and concealed himself more carefully than before. At length she turned in the direction of the town. It was a quaint old place, a royal borough for 5 centuries, with streets irregular and houses of much individuality. Most of the latter were humble in appearance, bare and hard in form, and grey in hue. But there were curious corners, low archways, uncompromising gables, some with corbel steps, now and then an outside stair, a delicious little dormer window, or a Gothic doorway, sometimes with a bit of carving over it. With the bent head of the climber, Miss Horne was walking up a certain street, called from its precipitousness the straight, that is, difficult, path, an absolute hill of difficulty, when she was accosted by an elderly man, who stood in the doorway of one of the houses.
"Ken you who's yon watching you frae the top of the brae, mem?" he said.
Miss Horne looked up. There was no one there.
"Ah, that's it. He's away again. That's the way he's been doing this last hour, at least to my knowledge. I saw him watching ilka move you made, mem, all the time you was down upon the shore, and there he is now, or was a minute ago, at the head of the brae, glowering the een out o' his head at you, mem."
"Div ye ken him?" asked Miss Horne.
"No, mem, 'cept I say to ye, he hasna been lang about the town. Some folks say he's demented, but he's unco quiet, spakes to nobody, and gin anybody spake to him, just runs." "Could he be kennin' you now? Ye're a stranger here, mem."
"Not sic a stranger, John," returned Miss Horne, calling the man by his name, for she recognized him as the beadle of the parish church. "What's the body like?"
"A poor wee hump-backed cratur, with a face o' a gentleman."
"I ken him well," said Miss Horne.
"He is a gentleman, gin ever God made one. But he's sair afflickit."
"Where does he lie at night? Can you tell me?"
"I ken naething about him, mem, by what comes o' seein' him sic like as the day, and once teetin' in at the door o' the kirk. I would ha' wist him till a seat, but the moment I looked at him, away he ran. He's unco changed, though, sin' the first time I saw him."
Since he lost Feemy, fear had been slaying him. No one knew where he slept, but in the daytime he haunted the streets, judging them safer than the fields or woods. The moment anyone accosted him, however, he fled like the wind. He had no art to find the mind's construction in the face, and not knowing whom to trust, he distrusted all. Humanity was good in his eyes, but there was no man. The vision of Miss Horne was like the dayspring from on high to him. With her near, the hosts of the Lord seemed to encamp around him, but the one word he had heard her utter about his back had caused in him an invincible repugnance to appearing before her, and hence it was that at a distance he had haunted her steps, without nearer approach. There was indeed a change upon him. His clothes hung about him, not from their own ragged condition only, but also from the state of skin and bone to which he was reduced, his hump showing like a great peg over which they had been carelessly cast. Half the round of his eyes stood out from his face, whose pallor betokened the ever-recurring rush of the faintly sallying troops back to the citadel of the heart. He had always been ready to run, but now he looked as if nothing but weakness and weariness kept him from running always. Miss Horne had presently an opportunity of marking the sad alteration. For ere she reached the head of the straight path, she heard sounds as of boys at play, and coming out on the level of the high street, saw a crowd, mostly of little boys, in the angle made by a garden wall with a house, whose gable stood halfway across the pavement. It being Saturday, they had just left school in all the exuberance of spirits to which a half-holiday gives occasion. In most of them, the animal nature was, for the time at least, far wider awake than the human, and their proclivity towards the sport of the persecutor was strong. To them, any living thing that looked at once odd and helpless was an outlaw, a creature to be tormented, or at best hunted beyond the visible world. A meagre cat, an overfed pet spaniel, a ditchless frog, a horse whose days hung over the verge of the knacker's yard. Each was theirs, in virtue of the amusement latent in it, which it was their business to draw out. But of all such property, an idiot would yield the most, and a hunchback idiot, such as was the Laird in their eyes, was absolutely invaluable, beyond comparison the best game in the known universe. When he left Port Lossie, the Laird knew pretty well what risks he ran, although he preferred even them to the dangers he hoped by his flight to avoid. It was he whom the crowd in question surrounded. They had begun by rough teasing, to which he had responded with smiles, a result which did not at all gratify them, their chief object being to enrage him. They had therefore proceeded to small torments, and were ready to go on to worse, their object being with the Laird hard to compass. Unhappily, there were amongst them 2 or 3 bigger boys. The moment Miss Horne descried what they were about, she rushed into the midst of them, like a long bolt from a catapult, and scattering them right and left from their victim, turned and stood in front of him, regarding his persecutors with defiance in her flaming eye, and vengeance in her indignant nose. But there was about Miss Horne herself enough of the peculiar to mark her also, to the superficial observer, as the natural prey of boys. And the moment the first billow of consternation had passed and sunk, beginning to regard her as she stood, the vain imagination awoke in these young lords of misrule. They commenced their attack upon her by resuming it upon her protégé. She spread out her skirts, far from voluminous, to protect him as he cowered behind them, and so long as she was successful in shielding him, her wrath smouldered, but powerfully. At length, one of the bigger boys, creeping slyly up behind the front row of smaller ones, succeeded in poking a piece of iron rod past her, and drawing a cry from the Laird. Out blazed the lurking flame. The boy had risen, and was now attempting to prosecute like an ape what he had commenced like a snake. Inspired by the God of armies, the Lord of hosts, she rushed upon him and struck him into the gutter. He fell in the very spot where he had found his weapon, and there he lay. The Christian Amazon turned to the Laird. Overflowing with compassion, she stooped and kissed his forehead, then took him by the hand to lead him away. But most of the enemy had gathered around their fallen comrade, and seized with some anxiety as to his condition, Miss Horne approached the group. The instant she turned towards it, the Laird snatched his hand from hers, darted away like a hunting spider, and shot down the straight path to the low street. By the time his protectress had looked over the heads of the group, seen that the young miscreant was not seriously injured, and requested him to take that for meddling with a helpless innocent, the object of her solicitude, whom she supposed standing behind her, was nowhere to be seen. 20 voices, now obsequious, were lifted to acquaint her with the direction in which he had gone, but it was vain to attempt following him, and she pursued her way, somewhat sore at his want of faith in her, to the house of a certain relative, a dressmaker, whom she visited as often as she went to Duff Harbour. Now Miss Forsyth was one of a small sect of worshippers which had, not many years before, built a chapel in the town. A quiet, sober, devout company, differing from their neighbours in nothing deeply touching the welfare of humanity. Their chief fault was that, attributing to comparative trifles a hugely disproportionate value, they would tear the garment in pieces rather than yield their notion of the right way of wrapping it together. It so happened that the next morning a minister famous in the community was to preach to them, on which ground Miss Forsyth persuaded her relative to stop over the Sunday, and go with her to their chapel. Bethinking herself next that her minister had no sermon to prepare, she took Miss Horne to call upon him. Mr. Bigg was one of those men whose faculty is always underestimated by their acquaintances and overestimated by their friends. To overvalue him was impossible. He was not merely of the salt of the earth, but of the leaven of the kingdom, contributing more to the true life of the world than many a thousand far more widely known and honored. Such as this man are the chief springs of thought, feeling, inquiry, action in their neighborhood. They radiate help and breathe comfort. They reprove, they counsel, they sympathize. In a word, they are the doorkeepers of the house of God. Constantly upon its threshold, and every moment pushing the door to peep in, they let out radiance enough to keep the hearts of men believing in the light. They make an atmosphere about them in which spiritual things can thrive, and out of their school often come men who do greater things, better they cannot do, than they. Although a separatist as to externals, he was in heart a most Catholic man, would have found himself far too Catholic for the community over which he presided, had its members been capable of understanding him. Indeed, he had with many, although such was the force of his character that no one dared a word to that effect in his hearing, the reputation of being lax in his ideas of what constituted a saving faith. And most of the sect being very narrow-minded, if not small-hearted, in their limitations of the company fitly partaking of the Last Supper of our Lord, requiring proof of intellectual accord with themselves as to the how and why of many things, especially in regard of what they called the plan of salvation, he was generally judged to be misled by the deceitful kindliness of the depraved human heart, in requiring as the ground of communion only such an uplook to Jesus as, when on earth, Jesus himself had responded to with healing. He was larger-hearted, and therefore larger-minded, than his people. In the course of their conversation, Miss Forsyth recounted, with some humour, her visitor's prowess on behalf of the laird, much to honest Mr. Bigg's delight.
"What ither could I do?" said Miss Horne apologetically. "But I doubt I struck ower sair. Maybe you wouldna object, sir, to gang and speir after the laddie, and gie him some good advice."
"I'll do that," returned Mr. Bigg. "Are we to have the pleasure of your company in our conventicle tomorrow?" he added, after a little pause. "Dr. Blair is going to preach."
"Will ye have me, Mr. Bigg?"
"Most willingly, ma'am. And we'll be still better pleased if you'll sit down with us to the Lord's table afterwards."
"I gang to the Paris kirk, ye ken," said Miss Horne,
supposing the good man unaware of the fact. "Oh, I know that, ma'am. But don't you think, as we shall, I trust, sit down together to his heavenly supper, it would be a good preparation to sit down together, once at least, to his earthly supper first?"
"I dinna ken 'at you would have ony but your ain folk. I hae aften thought mysel' it was just the one thing ony Christian should be ready to do wi' ony other. Is it a new thing wi' ye to hold open house this gait, sir, gien I may take the liberty to speir?"
"We don't exactly keep open house. We wouldn't like to have anyone with us who would count it poor fare. But still less would we like to exclude one of the Lord's friends. If that is a new thing, it ought to be an old one. You believe in Jesus Christ, don't you, ma'am?"
"I dinna ken whether I believe in him as ye would call believin' or no. There's sic a heap o' things brought to the fore nowadays that I cannot rightly say I understan'. But as he deed for me, I would dee for him. Raither nor say I didna ken him, I would hang aside him. Peter an' a', I canna say less."
Mr. Bigg's eyes began to smart, and he turned away his head.
"Gien that'll do wi' ye," Miss Horne went on, "an' ye mean nae desertion of the kirk o' my father and his fathers afore him, I would willingly partake wi' ye."
"You'll be welcome, Miss Horne, as welcome as any of my own flock."
"Weel now, that I call Christian,"
said Miss Horne, rising.
"And 'deed I could wuss," she added, "'at in our ain kirk we had mair opportunity, For once in the 12 months no very often to take up the thoughts that belong to the holy ordinance.
The next day, after a powerful sermon from a man who, although in high esteem, was not for moral worth or heavenly insight to be compared with him whose place he took, they proceeded to the celebration of the Lord's Supper, after the fashion of that portion of the Church Universal. The communicants sat in several long pews facing the communion table, which was at the foot of the pulpit. After the reading of St. Paul's account of the institution of the Lord's Supper, accompanied by prayers and addresses, the deacons carried the bread to the people, handing a slice to the first in each pew. Each person in turn broke off a portion and handed what remained to the next. Thus they divided it among themselves. It so happened that in moving up to the communion seats, Miss Forsyth and Miss Horne were the last to enter one of them, and Miss Horne, very needlessly insisting on her custom of having her more capable ear towards her friend, occupied the place next the passage. The service had hardly commenced when she caught sight of the face of the mad laird peeping in at the door, which was in the side of the building near where she sat. Their eyes met. With a half-repentant, half-apologetic look, he crept in, and, apparently to get as near his protectress as he could, sat down in the entrance of an empty pew, just opposite the one in which she was seated, on the other side of the narrow passage. His presence attracted little notice, for it was quite usual for individuals of the congregation who were not members of the church to linger on the outskirts of the company as spectators. By the time the piece of bread reached Miss Horne from the other end, it was but a fragment. She broke it in two, and reserving one part for herself, in place of handing the remnant to the deacon who stood ready to take it, stretched her arm across the passage and gave it to Mr. Stewart, who had been watching the proceedings intently. He received it from her hand, bent his head over it devoutly, and ate it, unconscious of the scandalized looks of the deacon, who knew nothing of the miserable object thus accepting rather than claiming a share in the common hope of men. When the cup followed, the deacon was on the alert, ready to take it at once from the hands of Miss Horne. But as it left her lips, she rose, grasping it in both hands, and with the dignity of a messenger of the Most High, before which the deacon drew back, bore it to the laird, and having made him drink the little that was left, yielded it to the conservator of holy privileges, with the words, "Hoots, man, the poor body never had a taste of the balm of Gilead in all his persecuted life afore." The liberality of Mr. Bigg had not been lost upon her. Freely she had received, freely she gave. What was good must, because it was good, be divided with her neighbour. It was a lawless act. As soon as the benediction was spoken, the laird slipped away, but as he left the seat, Miss Horne heard him murmur, the bonny man, the bonny man." He could hardly have meant the deacon. He might have meant Mr. Bigg, who had concluded the observance with a simple and loving exhortation. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 61. Miss Horne and the Piper. When Miss Horne bethought herself that night, in prospect of returning home the next day, that she had been twice in the company of the laird, and had not even thought of asking him about Feemy, she reproached herself not a little, and it was with shame that she set out, immediately on her arrival, to tell Malcolm that she had seen him. No one at the house being able to inform her where he was at the moment, she went on to Duncan's cottage. There she found the piper, who could not tell her where his boy was, but gave her a hearty welcome, and offered her a cup of tea, which, as it was now late in the afternoon, Miss Horne gladly accepted. As he bustled about to prepare it, refusing all assistance from his guest, he began to open his mind to her on a subject much in his thoughts, namely, Malcolm's inexplicable aversion to Mrs. Stewart.
"The name of Stewart will be a noble word, mem," he said.
"That's good enough to ken a body by," answered Miss Horne.
"If the boy will be a Stewart,"
he went on, heedless of the indifference of her remark,
Who'll be knowing but he may be of the blood royal?
There didna look to be muckle royalty about old John, honest man, who couldna rule a wife though he had but one, returned Miss Horne.
If you'll please, mem, don't you'll be too sharp on the poor man, whose wife will not be the good wife. If the wife will be the bad wife, she will be the bad wife, however, and the poor man will be having the bad wife, and the bad blame of it too, and that will be more as'll be fair, mem.
"'Deed, ye never said a truer word, Maister MacPhail," assented Miss Horne. "It's a mercy at a lone woman like me, who has a masterful temper of her ain, and nae feelings, was never put into the temptation of occupying such a peerless position. I doubt gin old John had been married upon me, I might ha' putten on the wrong clothes some morning mysel, and maybe had ill getting of them off again." The old man was silent, and Miss Horne resumed the main subject of their conversation. "But though he might not object till a father, if he wasn't just Hector or Goliath o' Gath," she said, "ye canna wonder if a young lad no caring to have sic a mither."
"And what would be the harm with the mother? Will she not be a good woman, and a good lady more to the bargain?"
"Ye ken what folk says till her guideship or her son."
"Yes, but that will be the lies of the peoples. The peoples was always telling lies."
"Well, allowin', it's a pity you not ken, supposin' him to be hers, how small folk holds the chance o' his being a Stewart for all that."
"She'll not be comprestanding you,"
said Duncan, bewildered.
"He's a wise son 'at kens his ain father,"
remarked Miss Horne, with more point than originality. "The lady never bore the best o' characters, as far as my memory takes me, and that's back afore John and her was married anygate. Na, John Stewart never took a dwam 'cause Malcolm MacPhail was upon the road." Miss Horne was sufficiently enigmatical, but her meaning had at length, more through his own reflection than her exposition, dawned upon Duncan. He leaped up with a Gaelic explosion of concentrated force, and cried,
"The woman is not be no mother's to Duncan's boy."
"Hooly, Mr. MacPhail," interposed Miss Horne, with good-natured revenge. "It may be nothing but folks' lies, ye ken."
"The woman that the peoples will be telling lies of her was not be the mother of her boy Malcolm. Why didn't the boy tell her the why that he wouldn't be having her?"
"Ye wouldna have him spread an ill report of his ain mither."
"But she'll not be his mither, and you will not believe it, mem."
"Ye cannot prove that. You nor him either."
"It will be more as would kill her boy to have a woman like that to the mother of him."
"It would be near han as ill having her for a wife," assented Miss Horne. "But no freely," she added. The old man sought the door, as if for a breath of air. But as he went, he blundered, and felt about as if he had just been struck blind. Ordinarily, he walked in his own house at least as if he saw every inch of the way. Presently he returned, and resumed his seat. "Was the bairn laid mither naked intil your hands, Maister MacPhail?" asked Miss Horne, who had been meditating.
"Och no, he was his clothes on," answered Duncan.
"Ha' ye any o' them left?" she asked again.
"Indeed not," answered Duncan. "Yes, indeed not."
"Ye lay at the salmon, didna ye?"
"Yes, mem, and they was good to her."
"Who dressed the bairn till ye?"
"Och, she'll dressed him hersel'," said Duncan,
still jealous of the women who had nursed the child.
"But no I," suggested Miss Horne. "Mistress Parton will be doing a good deal at dressing him sometimes. Mistress Parton is a good woman when she'll be good. Very good when she'll be good."
Here Malcolm entered, and Miss Horne told him what she had seen of the laird, and gathered concerning him. "That looks ill for Feemy," remarked Malcolm, when she had described his forlorn condition. "She canna be with him, or he would not be like that. Ha' ye anything by way of counsel, mem?" "I would counsel a word with the laird himsel', gin it be to be gotten. He may not ken what's happened her, but he may tell ye the last he saw o' her, and that maun be mair nor ye ken. He's ta'en sic a dote o' me 'at I'm feared it'll be hard to come at him, and still harder to come at speech o' him, for when he's frighted he can hardly move his jaw bone, not to say spake. I maun try, though, and do my best. Ye think he's lurking about Fife House, div ye, mem?" "He's been seen there away this while, aff and on."
Well, I's just gang and put on my fisher clothes and set out at once. I'm on hode o'er to Scarnose first, though, to let them ken 'at he's been gotten sight o'. It'll be but small comfort, I doubt." "Malcolm, my son," interjected Duncan, who had been watching for the conversation to afford him an opening. "If you'll be meeting anyone will call you the son of that woman, give him a good blow in the face, for you'll be no son of hers, even if she'll prove it, no more as hersel. If you'll be her son, old Duncan will be disown you forever and ever more, amen."
"What's brought you to this, Daddy?" asked Malcolm, who, ill as he liked the least allusion to the matter, could not help feeling curious, and indeed almost amused.
"Never you mind. Miss Horne will be having good reasons that Mistress Stewart'll not can be your mother."
Malcolm turned to Miss Horne. "I've said nothing to Maister MacPhail but what I've said more nor once to yoursel, laddie," she replied to the eager questioning of his eyes. "Gang your ways. The truth maun cow the lay in the long run. Off with ye to Blue Peter." When Malcolm reached Scarnose, he found Feemy's parents in a sad state. Joseph had returned that morning from a fruitless search in a fresh direction, and reiterated disappointment seemed to have at length overcome Annie's endurance, for she had taken to her bed. Joseph was sitting before the fire on a three-legged stool, rocking himself to and fro in a dull agony. When he heard Malcolm's voice, he jumped to his feet, and a flash of hope shot from his eyes. But when he had heard all, he sat down again without a word, and began rocking himself as before. Mrs. Mair was lying in the darkened closet, where, the door being partly opened, she had been listening with all her might, and was now weeping afresh. Joseph was the first to speak. Still rocking himself with hopeless oscillation, he said in a strange muffled tone which seemed to come from somewhere else,
"Gin I kent she was well dead, I would not care. It's not like a father to be sitting here. But where'll I gae next? The wife thinks I might be doing something. I kenna what to do. This last news is waur nor none. I had most no faith left."
"Malcolm, man!" And with a bitter cry he started to his feet. "I maist dinna believe there is a God of all. It disna look like it, dis it no?" There came an answering cry from the closet. Annie rushed out, half undressed, and threw her arms about her husband. "Joseph! Joseph!" she said, in a voice hard with agony, almost more dreadful than a scream. "Gin ye speak like that, you'll drive me mad. Let the lassie gang, but leave me my God." Joseph pushed her gently away, turned from her, fell on his knees, and moaned out, "O God, gin thou has her, we said neither greet nor grumble, but dinna take the faith frae us." He remained on his knees, silent, with his head against the chimney jamb. His wife crept away to her closet. "Peter," said Malcolm, "I'm gaein' aff the night to look for the laird, and see gin he can tell us anything about her. Wouldna ye better come with me?" To the heart of the father it was as the hope of the resurrection of the world. The same moment he was on his feet and taking down his bonnet. The next he disappeared in the closet, and Malcolm heard the tinkling of the money in the lidless teapot. Then out he came with a tear on his face and a glimmer in his eyes. The sun was down, and a bone-piercing chill, incarnate in the vague mist that haunted the ground, assailed them as they left the cottage. The sea moaned drearily. A smoke seemed to ascend from the horizon halfway to the zenith, something too thin for cloud, too black for vapour. Above that the stars were beginning to shine. Joseph shivered and struck his hands against his shoulders. "Care is cold, Rife," he said, and strode on. Almost in silence they walked together to the county town, put up at a little inn near the river, and at once began to make inquiries. Not a few persons had seen the laird at different times, but none knew where he slept or chiefly haunted. There was nothing for it but to set out in the morning and stray hither and thither, on the chance of somewhere finding him. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 62 The Cuttlefish and the Crab. Although the better portion of the original assembly had forsaken the bailie's barn, there was still a regular gathering in it as before, and if possible, even a greater manifestation of zeal for the conversion of sinners. True, it might not be clear to an outsider that they always made a difference between being converted and joining their company, so ready were they to mix up the two in their utterances. And the results of what they counted conversion were sometimes such as the opponents of their proceedings would have had them. The arrogant became yet more arrogant, and the greedy more greedy. The tongues of the talkative went yet faster, and the gadabouts were yet seldomer at home, while there was such a superabundance of private judgment that it overflowed the cisterns of their own concerns and invaded the walled gardens of other people's motives. Yet, notwithstanding, the good people got good, if the other sort got evil, for the meek shall inherit the earth, even when the priest ascends the throne of Augustus. No worse thing ever done in the name of Christianity, no vilest corruption of the Church, can destroy the eternal fact that the core of it is in the heart of Jesus. Branches innumerable may have to be lopped off and cast into the fire, yet the word, I am the vine, remaineth. The demagogues had gloried in the expulsion of such men as James Gentle and Blue Peter, and were soon rejoiced by the return of Bowamiel, after a season of backsliding to the flesh-pots of Egypt, as they called the services of the parish church, to the bosom of the barn, where he soon was again one of the chief amongst them. Meantime the circles of their emanating influence continued to spread, until at length they reached the lower classes of the upper town, of whom a few began to go to barn. Amongst them, for reasons best known to herself, though they might be surmised by such as really knew her, was Mrs. Catanagh. I do not know that she ever professed repentance and conversion, but for a while she attended pretty often. Possibly business considerations had something to do with it. Assuredly the young preacher, though he still continued to exhort, did so with failing strength, and it was plain to see that he was going rapidly. The exercise of the second of her twin callings might be required. She could not, however, have been drawn by any large expectations as to the honorarium. Still, she would gain what she prized even more, a position for the moment at the heart of affairs, with its excelling chances of hearing and overhearing. Never had lover of old books half the delight in fitting together a rare volume from scattered portions picked up in his travels than Mrs. Catanagh found in vitalizing stray remarks, arranging odds and ends of news, and cementing the many fragments, with the help of the babblings of gossip, into a plausible whole. Intellectually considered, her special pursuit was inasmuch the nobler, as the faculties it brought into exercise were more delicate and various. And if her devotion to the minutiae of biography had no high end in view, it never caused her to lose sight of what ends she had, by involving her in opinions, prejudices, or disputes. However she might break out at times, her general policy was to avoid quarrelling. There was a strong natural antagonism between her and the Partness, but she had never shown the least dislike to her, and that although Mrs. Findlay had never lost an opportunity of manifesting hers to the midwife. Indeed, having gained a pretext by her ministrations to Lizzie when overcome by the suggestions of the dog sermon, Mrs. Catanagh had essayed an approach to her mother, and not without success. After the discovery of the physical cause of Lizzie's ailment, however, Mrs. Findlay had sought, by might of rude resolve, to break loose from the encroaching acquaintanceship, but had found as yet that the hard-shelled crab was not a match for the glutinous cuttlefish. On the evening of the Sunday following the events related in the last chapter, Mrs. Catanagh had, not without difficulty, persuaded Mrs. Findlay to accompany her to the bailie's barn, with the promise of a wonderful sermon from a new preacher, a ploughman on an inland farm. That she had an object in desiring her company that night may seem probable from the conversation which arose as they plodded their way thither along the sands.
"I heard a queer tale about Meg Horn at Duff Harbour the other day," said the midwife,
speaking thus disrespectfully, both to ease her own heart, and to call forth the feelings of her companion, who also, she knew, disliked Miss Horn.
"Aye, and what might that be?" "But she's maybe a friend o' yours, Mrs. Findlay. Some folk likes her, though I cannot say I'm one of them."
"Friend o' mine!" exclaimed the partness.
"We gree like twa bulls in the same park. I wouldna wonder, for they tell't me it saw her fighting in the High Street with a muckle loon, near han as big as hersel. And haith, but Meg had the best o' it, and dang him into the gutter, and maist felt him. And that's Meg Horn. She had been at the drink. But I never heard it laid till her afore." "Didna ye, then?" "Well, I'm no saying anything. That's what I heard." "Oh, it's like enough. She was bulleragging at me no longer ago nor this dreen, but I doubt I sent her away with a flea in her lug." "What in a craw had she to pluck wi' you, no?" "Oh, fegs, you would hae ta'en her for a thief catcher and me for the thief. She would dreep it I bud to a keep at some o' the duds that happit Malcolm MacPhail, the reprobate, when first he came to the seaton. A poor scraichin' brat, as red as a biled lobster. Was me it ever he was created. It just drives me horn daft to think it ever he got the breast o' me, 'at he should serve me sae. But I s' hae a grip o'm yet, or my name's no what they call me." "It's the way o' the world, Mistress Findlay. What could ye expect o' one born in sin and brought forth in iniquity?" A stock phrase of Mrs. Catnaugh's, glancing at her profession, and embracing nearly the whole of her belief. "It's a true word. The mair's the pity he should ha' had the milk o' an honest woman upon the tap o' that." "But what could the old runt be after? What was her business with it? She never did anything for the bairn." "Na, no she. She never had the chance, good or ill." "Oh, doubtless it would be anent what they call the identifying o' him to the Lady o' Garsfell. She had sent her. She might ha' whaled a mair welcome messenger and sent her a better errand, but she made little o' me." "Ye had nothing o' the kind, I s' wad." "Never a thread. There was a 1200 shift upon the bairn, wrote round him like dead clothes, gien it had been but the Lord's wull. It gart me wonner at the time, for that wasna how a bairn 'at had been cared for should be clad." "Was there name or mark upon it?" asked Cuttlefish. "None. There was but the place where the red ingrain had been piked out," answered Crab. "And what came o' the shift?" "Oh, I just made it down for a bit sark to the bairn when he grew to be running about. At ever I should ha' taken stick and cloth for sic a Dale's bookie. To me it was a mither till him. The Lord haud me on gan mad when I think o't." "And syne for Lizzie," began Mrs. Catnaugh, prefacing fresh remark. But at her name the mother flew into such a rage that, fearful of scandal, seeing it was the Sabbath and they were on their way to public worship, her companion would have exerted all her powers of oiliest persuasion to appease her. But if there was one thing Mrs. Catnaugh did not understand, it was the heart of a mother. "Hoots, Mistress Findlay, folk'll hear ye. Hold your tongue, I beg. She may deen the strae for me. I s' never put hand to the saving o' her, or her bairn either," said the midwife, thinking thus to pacify her. Then, like the eruption following mere volcanic unrest, out brake the sore-hearted woman's wrath. And now, at length, the crustacean was too much for the mollusk. She raved and scolded and abused Mrs. Catnaugh, till at last she was driven to that final resource, the airs of an injured woman. She turned and walked back to the upper town, while Mrs. Findlay went on to take what share she might in the worship of the congregation. Mrs. Mair had that evening gone once more to the Bailey's barn in her husband's absence. For the words of unbelief he had uttered in the Job-like agony of his soul had haunted the heart of his spouse, until she too felt as if she could hardly believe in a God. Few know what a poor thing their faith is, till the trial comes. And in the weakness consequent on protracted suffering, she had begun to fancy that the loss of Feemy was a punishment upon them,
for deserting the conventicle. Also, the schoolmaster was under an interdict, and that looked like a judgment too. She must find some prop for the faith that was now shaking like a reed in the wind. So to the bailie's barn she had gone. The tempest which had convulsed Mrs. Findlay's atmosphere had swept its vapours with it as it passed away, and when she entered the cavern it was with an unwonted inclination to be friendly all round. As fate would have it, she unwittingly took her place by Mrs. Mayor, whom she had not seen since she gave Lizzie shelter. When she discovered who her neighbour was, she started away and stared, but she had had enough of quarrelling for the evening, and besides had not had time to bar her door against the angel Pity, who suddenly stepped across the threshold of her heart with the sight of Mrs. Mayor's pale, thin cheeks and tear-reddened eyes. As suddenly, however, an indwelling demon of her own house, whose name was Envy, arose from the ashes of her hearth to meet the white-robed visitant. Feemy, poor little harmless thing, was safe enough. Who would harm a hair of her? But Lizzie. And this woman had taken in the fugitive from honest chastisement. She would yet have sought another seat, but the congregation rose to sing, and her neighbour's offer of the use in common of her psalm-book was enough to quiet for the moment the gaseous brain of the turbulent woman. She accepted the kindness, and, the singing over, did not refuse to look on the same holy page with her daughter's friend, while the ploughman read, with fitting simplicity, the parable of the prodigal son. It touched something in both, but a different something in each. Strange to say, neither applied it to her own case, but each to her neighbour's. As the reader uttered the words, "was lost and is found," and ceased, each turned to the other with a whisper. Mrs. Mayor persisted in hers, and the other, which was odd enough, yielded and listened. "Would the tale hold with lassies as well as laddies, Mistress Findlay, do you think?" said Mrs. Mayor. "Oh, surely," was the response. "It mun do that. There's no respect of persons with him. There's not a doubt but your Feemy'll come home to you safe and sound." "I was thinking about Lizzie," said the other, a little astonished, and then the prayer began, and they had to be silent. The sermon of the ploughman was both dull and sensible, an excellent variety where few of the sermons were either, but it made little impression on Mrs. Findlay or Mrs. Mayor. As they left the cave together in the crowd of issuing worshippers, Mrs. Mayor whispered again, "I would invite you o'er, but you would be wanting Lizzie home, and I can ill spare the comfort o'er the know," she said, with the cunning of a dove. "And what comes o' me?" rejoined Mrs. Findlay, her claws out in a moment where her personal consequence was touched. "You would not surely take her frae me all at once," pleaded Mrs. Mayor. "You might let her bide, just till Feemy comes hame, and syne—" But there she broke down, and the tempest of sobs that followed quite overcame the heart of Mrs. Findlay. She was, in truth, a woman like another. Only, being of the crustacean order, she had not yet swallowed her skeleton, as all of us have to do more or less, sooner or later, the idea of that scaffolding being that it should be out of sight. With the best commonplaces at her command, she sought to comfort her companion, walked with her to the foot of the red path, found her much more to her mind than Mrs. Cattenaw, seemed inclined to go with her all the way, but suddenly stopped, bade her good night, and left her. End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 63. Miss Horne and Lord Lossie. Notwithstanding the quarrel, Mrs. Cattenaw did not return without having gained something. She had learned that Miss Horne had been foiled in what she had no doubt was an attempt to obtain proof that Malcolm was not the son of Mrs. Stewart. The discovery was a grateful one, for who could have told but there might be something in existence, to connect him with another origin than she and Mrs. Stewart would assign him. The next day the Marquis returned. Almost his first word was the desire that Malcolm should be sent to him, but nobody knew more than that he was missing, whereupon he sent for Duncan. The old man explained his boy's absence, and as soon as he was dismissed, took his way to the town, and called upon Miss Horne. In half an hour, the good lady started on foot for Duff Harbour. It was already growing dark, but there was one feeling Miss Horne had certainly been created without, and that was fear. As she approached her destination, tramping eagerly along, in a half-cloudy, half-starlit night, with a damp east wind blowing cold from the German Ocean, she was startled by the swift rush of something dark across the road before her. It came out of a small wood on the left towards the sea, and bolted through a hedge on the right. "Is that you, Laird?" she cried, but there came no answer. She walked straight to the house of her lawyer friend, and after an hour's rest, the same night set out again for Port Lossie, which she reached in safety by her bedtime. Lord Lossie was very accessible. Like Shakespeare's Prince Hal, he was so much interested in the varieties of the outcome of human character that he would not willingly lose a chance of seeing more man. If the individual proved a bore, he would get rid of him without remorse. If amusing, he would contrive to prolong the interview. There was a great deal of undeveloped humanity somewhere in his lordship, one of whose indications was this spectacular interest in his kind. As to their bygone history, how they fared out of his sight, or what might become of them, he never gave a thought to anything of the kind, never felt the pull of one of the bonds of brotherhood, laughed at them the moment they were gone, or, if a woman's story had touched him, wiped his eyes with an oath, and thought himself too good a fellow for this world. Since his retirement from the more indolent life of the metropolis to the quieter and more active pursuits of the country, his character had bettered a little, inasmuch as it was a shade more accessible to spiritual influences. The hard soil had in a few places cracked a hair's breadth, and lay thus far open to the search of those sun-rays which, when they find the human germ, that is, the conscience, straightway begin to sting it into life. To this betterment the company of his daughter had chiefly contributed, for if she was little more developed in the right direction than himself, she was far less developed in the wrong, and the play of affection between them was the divinest influence that could as yet be brought to bear upon either. But certain circumstances of late had had a share in it, occasioning a revival of old memories, which had a considerably sobering effect upon him. As he sat at breakfast, about 11 o'clock on the morning after his return, one of his English servants entered with the message that a person calling herself Miss Horne, and refusing to explain her business, desired to see his lordship for a few minutes. "Who is she?" asked the Marquis. The man did not know. "What is she like?" "An odd-looking old lady, my lord, and very oddly dressed." "Show her into the next room. I shall be with her directly." Finishing his cup of coffee and peafowl's egg with deliberation, while he tried his best to recall in what connection he could have heard the name before, the Marquis at length sauntered into the morning-room in his dressing-gown, with the Times of the day before yesterday, just arrived, in his hand. There stood his visitor waiting for him, such as my reader knows her, black and gaunt and grim, in a bay window, whose light almost surrounded her, so that there was scarcely a shadow about her, and yet to the eyes of the Marquis she seemed wrapped in shadows. Mysterious as some sibyl, whose being held secrets the first whisper of which had turned her old, but made her immortal, she towered before him, with her eyes fixed upon him, and neither spoke nor moved. "To what am I indebted?" began his lordship, but Miss Horne speedily interrupted his courtesy. "Own to no debt, my lord, till ye ken what is for," she said, without a tone or inflection to indicate a pleasantry. "Good," returned his lordship, and waited with a smile. She promised amusement, and he was ready for it. But it hardly came. "Ken ye that hand o' reet, my lord?" she inquired, sternly advancing a step, and holding out a scrap of paper at arm's length, as if presenting a pistol. The Marquis took it. In his countenance, curiosity had mingled with the expectation. He glanced at it. A shadow swept over his face, but vanished instantly. The mask of impervious non-expression which a man of his breeding always knows how to assume was already on his visage. "Where did you get this?" he said quietly, with just the slightest catch in his voice.
"I got it, my lord, where there's mair like it."
"Show me them."
"I ha' shown you plenty for a swatch, my lord."
"You refuse?" said the Marquis, and the tone of the question was like the first cold puff that indicates a change of weather.
"I do, my lord,"
she answered imperturbably. "If they are not my property, why do you bring me this?"
"Are they your property, my lord?"
"This is my handwriting."
"Ye allow that?"
"Certainly, my good woman. You did not expect me to deny it."
"God forbid, my lord." "But will ye uphold yoursel the lawful heir to the deceased? It lies atween your lordship and mysel in the meantime."
He sat down, holding the scrap of paper between his finger and thumb. "I will buy them of you," he said coolly, after a moment's thought, and as he spoke he looked keenly at her. The form of reply which first arose in Miss Horne's indignant soul never reached her lips.
"It's not my trade," she answered, with the coldness of suppressed wrath. "I dinna deal in such wares."
"What do you deal in, then?" asked the Marquis.
"In truth and fair play, my lord,"
she answered, and was again silent. So was the Marquis for some moments, but was the first to resume. "If you think the papers to which you refer of the least value, allow me to tell you it is an entire mistake."
"There was one thought them of value,"
replied Miss Horne, and her voice trembled a little, but she hemmed away her emotion.
"For a time at least, my lord, and for her sake they're of value to me, be they what they may to your lordship. But who can tell? Scots law may put life into them yet, and gie them a value to somebody forby me."
"What I mean, my good woman, is, that if you think the possession of those papers gives you any hold over me which you can turn to your advantage, you are mistaken."
"God forgie you, my lord. My advantage! I thought your lordship had been mair o' a gentleman by this time, or I would have sent a lawyer till ye, in place o' comin' mysel."
"What do you mean by that?"
"It's plain ye couldna ha' been muckle o' a gentleman once, my lord, and it seems ye're no muckle mair o' one yet, for a' ye maun ha' come through in the meantime."
"I trust you have discovered nothing in those letters to afford ground for such a harsh judgment," said the Marquis seriously.
"Na, not a word in them, but the mair out o' them. Ye winna threep upon me at a man who leaves a woman, let alone his wife, or one 'at he calls his wife, to all the pains o' a mither, and all the penalties o' a unmarried one, on every spirit how she won through them, preserves the right he was born till o' being counted a gentleman. Onygate, a maiden woman like mysel who has nae feelings, will not allow him the title. God forbid it."
"You are plain spoken."
"I'm plain made, my lord. I ken good frae ill, and little forby. But I found that enough to serve my turn. Either the letters o' your lordship are ilk one o' them a lie, or ye deserted your wife and bairn."
"Alas," interrupted the Marquis with some emotion, "she deserted me, and took the child with her."
"Whoever dared sic a lie upon my Grisel?" shouted Miss Horne,
clenching and shaking her bony fist at the world in general.
"It was but a fortnight or 3 weeks, as near as I can tell, after the birth o' your bairn, that Grisel Cammel—"
"Were you with her then?" again interrupted the Marquis, in a tone of sorrowful interest.
"No, my lord, I was not. Gien I had been, I wouldna be upon sic an errand this day. For nigh 20 long years that her and me keepit hoose thegither, till she died in my arms, never a day was she out o' my sight, or once."
The Marquis leaped rather than started to his feet, exclaiming, "What in the name of God do you mean, woman?"
"I kenna what ye mean, my lord. I ken 'at I'm but tellin' ye the truth when I tell ye 'at Grisel Cammel up to that day, an' that's little ower 6 months since syne."
"Good God!" cried the Marquis. "And here have I— Woman, are you speaking the truth?"
"If," he added threateningly, and paused. "Layin's what I never could bide, my lord, an' I'm no likely to take till it at my age, with the long to come afore me."
The Marquis strode several times up and down the floor. "I'll give you £1,000 for those letters," he said, suddenly stopping in front of Miss Horne. "They're nae sic worth, my lord. I have your ain word for it. But I care not the leg o' a spin, Maggie, Daddy Longlegs. Part with him I will not, 'cept to him it proves himsel' the rightful heir to them. A husband inherits from his wife. Or maybe her son might claim first, I dinna ken. But there's lawyers, my lord, to red the doubt." "Her son? You don't mean—"
"I do mean Malcolm MacPhail, my lord."
"God in heaven!"
"His name's mair in your mou' nor in your heart, I'm thinking, my lord. Ye all cry out upon him, the men o' ye, when ye're in any trouble, or want to gar women believe ye. But I'm thinking he pays but little heed to sic prayers."
Thus Miss Horne, but Lord Lossie was striding up and down the room, heedless of her remarks, his eyes on the ground, his arms straight by his sides, and his hands clenched. "Can you prove what you say?" he asked at length, half stopping, and casting an almost wild look at Miss Horne, then resuming his hurried walk. His voice sounded hollow, as if sent from the heart of a gulf of pain.
"No, my lord," answered Miss Horne.
"Then what the devil," roared the Marquis, "do you mean by coming to me with such a cock and bull story?"
"There's neither cock crow nor bull roar intil it, my lord. I come to you with it in the hope ye'll help to red it up, for I dinna weel ken what we can do wantin' ye. There's but one kens all the truth o' it, and she's the awfullest lair out o' purgatory. Not I believe in purgatory, but it's the longer and lighter word to make use o'."
"Who is she?"
"By name she's Bobby Catnaugh, and by nature she's what I tell ye. And gin I had her atween my two een, it's what I would say to the face o' her. It can't be MacPhail.
Mrs. Stewart says he is her son, and the woman Catnaugh is her chief witness in support of the claim."
"The divil has a better to the two o' them, my lord, as they'll ken some day. His claim'll want no supportin'. Dinna ye believe a word Mr. Stewart or Bobby Catnaugh either would say to ye. Gin he be Mr. Stewart's, who was his father?"
"You think he resembles my late brother? He has a look of him, I confess."
"He has, my lord. But onybody 'at kent the mither of him, as you and me did, my lord, wad see another likeness as weel."
"I grant nothing."
"Ye grant Grizel Campbell your wife, my lord, when ye own to that right. Gin it were nothing but a written promise and a bairn to follow, it would be marriage enough in this country, though it may not be in countries no so civilized."
"But all that is nothing as to the child. Why do you fix on this young fellow? You say you can't prove it."
"But ye could, my lord, gin ye were set upon justice as I am. Gin ye winna move in the matter, we s'll manage to hirple through wantin' ye, though, with the Lord's help."
The Marquis, who had all this time continued his walk up and down the floor, stood still, raised his head as if about to speak, dropped it again on his chest, strode to the other window, turned, strode back, and said, "This is a very serious matter."
"It is at that, my lord,"
replied Miss Horne. "You must give me a little time to turn it over," said the Marquis.
"Isna 20 year time enough, my lord?" rejoined Miss Horne.
"I swear to you that till this moment I believed her 20 years in her grave. My brother sent me word that she died in childbed and the child with her. I was then in Brussels with the Duke." Miss Horne made 3 great strides, caught the Marquis's hand in both hers, and said,
"I praise God ye're an honest man, my lord."
"I hope so," said the Marquis, and seized the advantage. "You'll hold your tongue about this?" he asked, half inquiring, half requesting.
"As long as I see reason, my lord. No longer," answered Miss Horne, dropping his hand. "Right maun be done."
"Yes, if you can tell what right is, and avoid wrong to others."
"Right's right, my lord," persisted Miss Horne. "I'll have no qualifications."
His lordship once more began to walk up and down the room, every now and then taking a stolen glance at Miss Horne, a glance of uneasy, anxious questioning. She stood rigid, a very Lot's wife of immobility, her eyes on the ground, waiting what he would say next. "I wish I knew whether I could trust her," he said at length, as if talking aloud to himself. Miss Horne took no notice. "Why don't you speak, woman?" cried the Marquis with irritation. How he hated perplexity.
"Ye speered no question, my lord, and gin ye had, my word has ower little weight to answer with."
"Can I trust you, woman? I want to know," said his lordship angrily.
"No farther, my lord, nor to do what I think's right."
"I want to be certain that you will do nothing with those letters until you hear from me," said the Marquis, heedless of her reply.
"I'll do nothing afore the morn."
"Farrer nor that I winna pledge mysel'," answered Miss Horne, and with the words moved towards the door. "Hadn't you better take this with you?" said the Marquis, offering the little note, which he had carried all the time between his finger and thumb. "There's no occasion. I ha' plenty wantin' that. Only dinna leave it lying about." "There's small danger of that," said the Marquis, and rang the bell. The moment she was out of the way, he went up to his own room, and flinging the door to, sat down at the table, and laid his arms and head upon it. The acrid vapour of tears that should have been wept long since rose to his eyes. He dashed his hand across them, as if ashamed that he was not even yet out of sight of the kingdom of heaven. His own handwriting, of a period when all former sins and defilements seemed about to be burned clean from his soul by the fire of an honest and virtuous love, had moved him. For genuine had been his affection for the girl who had risked and lost so much for him. It was with no evil intent, for her influence had rendered him for the time incapable of playing her false, but in part from reasons of prudence, as he persuaded himself, for both their sakes, and in part led astray by the zest which minds of a certain cast derive from the secrecy of pleasure, that he had persuaded her to the unequal yoking of honesty and secrecy. But suddenly called away and sent by the prince on a private mission soon after their marriage, and before there was any special reason to apprehend consequences that must lead to discovery, he had, in the difficulties of the case and hope of a speedy return, left her without any arrangement for correspondence. And all he had ever heard of her more was from his brother, then the Marquis. A cynical account of the discovery of her condition, followed almost immediately by a circumstantial one of her death and that of her infant. He was deeply stung, and the thought of her sufferings in the false position where his selfishness had placed her haunted him for a time beyond his endurance. For of all things he hated suffering, and of all sufferings remorse is the worst. Hence, where a wiser man might have repented, he rushed into dissipation, whose scorching wind swept away not only the healing dews of his sorrow, but the tender buds of new life that had begun to model the withering tree of his nature. The desire after better things which had, under his wife's genial influence, begun to pass into effort, not only vanished utterly in the shameless round of evil distraction, but its memory became a mockery to the cynical spirit that arose behind the vanishing angel of repentance. And he was soon in the condition of the man from whom the exorcised demon had gone, but to find his 7 worse companions. Reduced at length to straits, almost to want, he had married the mother of Florimel, to whom for a time he endeavoured to conduct himself in some measure like a gentleman. For this he had been rewarded by a decrease in the rate of his spiritual submergence. But his bedraggled nature could no longer walk without treading on its own plumes, and the poor lady who had bartered herself for a lofty alliance speedily found her mistake a sad one, and her life uninteresting, took to repining and tears, alienated her husband utterly, and died of a sorrow almost too selfish to afford even a suggestion of purifying efficacy. But Florimel had not inherited immediately from her mother, so far as disposition was concerned. In these latter days she had grown very dear to him, and his love had once more turned his face a little towards the path of righteousness. Ah, when would he move one step to set his feet in it? And now, after his whirlwind harvest of evil knowledge, bitter disappointment, and fading passion, in the gathering mists of grey hopelessness, and the far worse mephitic air of indifference, he had come all of a sudden upon the ghastly discovery that, while overwhelmed with remorse for the vanished past, the present and the future had been calling him, but had now also, that present and that future, glided from him, and folded their wings of gloom in the land of shadows. All the fierce time he might have been blessedly growing better, instead of heaping sin upon sin, until the weight was too heavy for repentance. For while he had been bemoaning a dead wife, That wife had been loving a renegade husband. And the blame of it all he did not fail to cast upon the Providence in which until now he had professed not to believe. Such faith as he was yet capable of awoke in the form of resentment. He judged himself hardly done by, and the few admonitory sermons he had happened to hear, especially that in the cave about the dogs going round the walls of the New Jerusalem, returned upon him, not as warnings, but as old threats, now rapidly approaching fulfilment. Lovely still peered the dim face of his girl wife upon him, through the dusty lattice of his memory, and a mighty corroboration of Malcolm's asserted birth lay in the look upon his face as he hurried aghast from the hermit's cell. For not on his first had the Marquis seen that look, and in those very circumstances. And the youth was one to be proud of, one among a million. But there were other and terrible considerations. Incapable as he naturally was of doing justice to a woman of Miss Horne's inflexibility in right, he could yet more than surmise the absoluteness of that inflexibility, partly because it was hostile to himself, and he was in the mood to believe in opposition and harshness, and deny, not providence, but goodness. Convenient half-measures would, he more than feared, find no favour with her. But she had declared her inability to prove Malcolm his son without the testimony of Mrs. Catanagh, and the latter was even now representing him as the son of Mrs. Stewart. That Mrs. Catanagh at the same time could not be ignorant of what had become of the child born to him, he was all but certain. For on that night when Malcolm and he found her in the wizard's chamber, had she not proved her strange story, of having been carried to that very room blindfolded, and after sole attendance on the birth of a child, whose mother's features, even in her worst pains, she had not once seen, in like manner carried away again? Had she not proved the story true, by handing him the ring she had drawn from the lady's finger, and sewn, for the sake of future identification, into the lower edge of one of the bed-curtains, which ring was a diamond he had given his wife from his own finger when they parted? She probably believed the lady to have been Mrs. Stewart, and the late Marquis the father of the child. Should he see Mrs. Catanagh? And what then? He found no difficulty in divining the reasons which must have induced his brother to provide for the secret accouchement of his wife in the wizard's chamber, and for the abduction of the child. If indeed his existence was not owing to Mrs. Catanagh's love of intrigue. The elder had judged the younger brother unlikely to live long, and had expected his own daughter to succeed himself. But now the younger might any day marry the governess and legalize the child, and the elder had therefore secured the disappearance of the latter and the belief of his brother in the death of both. Lord Lossie was roused from his reverie by a tap at the door, which he knew for Malcolm's, and answered with admission. When he entered, his master saw that a change had passed upon him, and for a moment believed Miss Horne had already broken faith with him and found communication with Malcolm. He was soon satisfied of the contrary, however, but would have found it hard indeed to understand, had it been represented to him, that the contentment, almost elation, of the youth's countenance had its source in the conviction that he was not the son of Mrs. Stewart. "So here you are at last," said the Marquis.
"Ay, my lord."
"Did you find Stewart?"
"Ay, did we at last, my lord. But we made nothing by it, for he kent nought about the lassie, and maist lost his wits at the news."
"No great loss, that," said the Marquis. "Go and send Stoat here."
"Is there any hurry about Stoat, my lord?" answered Malcolm, hesitating. "I had a word to say to your lordship mysel."
"Make haste, then."
"I'm some fain to gang back to the fishing, my lord," said Malcolm. "This is ower easy a life for me. The deil wins in for the lifting o' the sneck. Forby, my lord, a life without either danger or work is some worse like. Insipid. It wants salt, my lord. But all that's neither here nor there, I ken, so long as ye want me out of the house, my lord."
"Who told you I wanted you out of the house? By Jove, I should have made shorter work of it. What put that in your head? Why should I?"
"Gin your lordship kens none, small occasion have I to hold a reason to your han. I thought, but the thought itself's impudence.
You young fool. You thought because I came upon you as I did in the garret the other night. Bah, you damned ape. As if I could not trust— Pshaw!"
For the moment, Malcolm forgot how angry his master had certainly been, although, for Florimell's sake, doubtless, he had restrained himself, and fancied that, in the faint light of the one candle, he had seen little to annoy him, and had taken the storm and its results, which were indeed the sole reason, as a sufficient one for their being alone together. Everything seemed about to come right again. But his master remained silent. "I hope my lady's well," ventured Malcolm at length.
"Quite well. She's with Lady Belair in Edinburgh."
Lady Belair was the bold-faced countess.
"I dinna like her," said Malcolm.
"Who the devil asked you to like her?" said the Marquis, but he laughed as he said it.
"I beg your lordship's pardon," returned Malcolm. "I said it or I kent. It was none of my business who my lady was with."
"Certainly not. But I don't mind confessing that Lady Belair is not one I should choose to give authority over Lady Florimell. You have some regard for your young mistress, I know, Malcolm."
"I would die for her, my lord."
"That's a common assertion," said the Marquis.
"No with fisher folk. I kenna how it may be with your folk, my lord."
"Well, even with us it means something. It implies at least that he who uses it would risk his life for her whom he wishes to believe it. But perhaps it may mean more than that in the mouth of a fisherman? Do you fancy there is such a thing as devotion? Real devotion, I mean. Self-sacrifice, you know?"
"I dare not doubt it, my lord."
"Without fee or hope of reward?"
"There maun be some capable of it, my lord, or what force should the world be? What ither should hold it on being destroyed, as Sodom was for the want of the 10 righteous? There maun be salt where corruption has not the thing all its own gate."
"You certainly have pretty high notions of things, MacPhail. For my part, I can easily enough imagine a man risking his life, but devoting it, that's another thing altogether."
"There maun be 'at would do all 'at could be done, my lord."
"What, for instance, would you do for Lady Florimell now? You say you would die for her. What does dying mean on a fisherman's tongue?"
"It means allthing, my lord. Short o' ill. I would starve for her, but I wouldna steal. I would fight for her, but I wouldna lie."
"Would you be her servant all your days? Come now."
"Mair nor willingly, my lord, gin she would only have me and keep me."
"But supposing you came to inherit the Kirkbyres' property?"
"My lord," said Malcolm solemnly, "that's a poor test to put me till. It gangs for naething. I would rather clean my lady's boots frae morning to night nor be the son o' that woman, gin she were a born duchess. Try me with something worth your lordship's mo'."
But the Marquis seemed to think he had gone far enough for the present. With gleaming eyes he rose, took his withered love-letter from the table, put it in his waistcoat pocket, and saying, "Well, find out for me what this is they're about with the schoolmaster," walked to the door.
"I ken all about that, my lord," answered Malcolm. "Unspirited at anybody."
Lord Lossie turned from the door, ordered him to bring his riding-coat and boots, and ringing the bell, sent a message to Stoat to saddle the bay mare. End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 64. The Laird and His Mother. When Malcolm and Joseph set out from Duff Harbour to find the Laird, they could hardly be said to have gone in search of him. All in their power was to seek the parts where he was occasionally seen, in the hope of chancing upon him. And they wandered in vain about the woods of Fife House all that week, returning disconsolate every evening to the little inn on the banks of the wan water. Sunday came and went without yielding a trace of him, and almost in despair, they resolved, if unsuccessful the next day, to get assistance and organize a search for him. Monday passed like the days that had preceded it, and they were returning dejectedly down the left bank of the wan water in the gloamin, and nearing a part where it is hemmed in by precipitous rocks, and is very narrow and deep, crawling slow and black under the lofty arch of an ancient bridge that spans it at one leap, when suddenly they caught sight of a head peering over the parapet.
They dared not run for fear of terrifying him, if it should be the laird, and hurried quietly to the spot. But when they reached the end of the bridge, its round back was bare from end to end. On the other side of the river, the trees came close up, and pursuit was hopeless in the gathering darkness. "Laird! Laird! They've ta'en away Feemy, and we dinna ken where to look for her," cried the poor father aloud. Almost the same instant, and as if he had issued from the ground, the laird stood before them. The men started back with astonishment, soon changed into pity, for there was light enough to see how miserable the poor fellow looked. Neither exposure nor privation had thus wrought upon him. He was simply dying of fear. Having greeted Joseph with embarrassment, he kept glancing doubtfully at Malcolm, as if ready to run on his least movement. In a few words, Joseph explained their quest, with trembling voice and tears that would not be denied, enforcing the tale. Ere he had done, the laird's jaw had fallen, and further speech was impossible to him. But by gestures sad and plain enough, he indicated that he knew nothing of her, and had supposed her safe at home with her parents. In vain they tried to persuade him to go back with them, promising every protection. For sole answer he shook his head mournfully. There came a sudden gust of wind among the branches. Joseph, little used to trees and their ways with the wind, turned towards the sound, and Malcolm unconsciously followed his movement. When they turned again, the laird had vanished, and they took their way homeward in sadness. What passed next with the laird can be but conjectured. It came to be well enough known afterwards where he had been hiding, and had it not been dusk as they came down the river-bank, the two men might, looking up to the bridge from below, have had it suggested to them. For in the half-spandrel wall between the first arch and the bank, they might have spied a small window, looking down on the sullen, silent gloom, foam-flecked with past commotion, that crept languidly away from beneath. It belonged to a little vaulted chamber in the bridge, devised by some banished lord as a kind of summer-house, long neglected, but having in it yet a mouldering table, a broken chair or two, and a rough bench. A little path led steep from the end of the parapet down to its hidden door. It was now used only by the gamekeepers for traps and fishing gear, and odds and ends of things, and was generally supposed to be locked up. The laird had, however, found it open, and his refuge in it had been connived at by one of the men, who, as they heard afterwards, had given him the key, and assisted him in carrying out a plan he had devised for barricading the door. It was from this place he had so suddenly risen at the call of Blue Peter, and to it he had as suddenly withdrawn again, to pass in silence and loneliness through his last purgatorial pain. Mrs. Stewart was sitting in her drawing-room alone. She seldom had visitors at Kirkbyres. Not that she liked being alone, or indeed being there at all, for she would have lived on the continent but that her son's trustees, partly to indulge their own aversion to her, taking upon them a larger discretionary power than rightly belonged to them, kept her too straitened, which no doubt in the recoil had its share in poor Stephen's misery. It was only after scraping for a whole year that she could escape to Paris or Hamburg, where she was at home. There her sojourn was determined by her good or ill fortune at Faro. What she meditated over her knitting by the firelight, she had put out her candles, it would be hard to say, perhaps unwholesome to think. There are souls, to look into which is to our dim eyes like gazing down from the verge of one of the Swedenborgian pits. But much of the evil done by human beings is as the evil of evil beasts. They know not what they do. An excuse which, except in regard of the past, no man can make for himself, seeing the very making of it must testify its falsehood. She looked up, gave a cry, and started to her feet. Stephen stood before her, halfway between her and the door. Revealed in a flicker of flame from the fire, he vanished in the following shade, and for a moment she stood in doubt of her seeing sense. But when the coal flashed again,
there was her son, regarding her out of great eyes that looked as if they had seen death. A ghastly air hung about him, as if he had just come back from Hades. But in his silent bearing there was a sanity, even dignity, which strangely impressed her. He came forward a pace or two, stopped, and said, "Dinna be frighted, mem. I'm come. Send the lassie hame, and do with me as ye like. I canna hold off o' me, but I think I'm dayin', and ye needna misguide me." His voice, although it trembled a little, was clear and unimpeded, and though weak, in its modulation, manly. Something in the woman's heart responded. Was it motherhood, or the deeper Godhead? Was it pity for the dignity housed in the crumbling clay, or repentance for the son of her womb? Or was it that sickness gave hope, and she could afford to be kind? "I don't know what you mean, Stephen," she said, more gently than he had ever heard her speak. Was it an agony of mind or of body? Or was it but a flickering of the shadows upon his face? A moment, and he gave a half-choked shriek, and fell on the floor. His mother turned from him with disgust, and rang the bell. "Send Tom here," she said. An elderly, hard-featured man came. "Stephen is in one of his fits," she said. The man looked about him. He could see no one in the room but his mistress. "There he is," she continued, pointing to the floor. "Take him away. Get him up to the loft and lay him in the hay." The man lifted his master like an unwieldy log, and carried him convulsed from the room. Stephen's mother sat down again by the fire, and resumed her knitting. End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 65. The Laird's Vision. Malcolm had just seen his master set out for his solitary ride, when one of the maids informed him that a man from Kirkbyres wanted him. Hiding his reluctance, he went with her and found Tom, who was Mrs. Stewart's grieve, and had been about the place all his days. "Mr. Stephen's come home, sir," he said, touching his bonnet, a civility for which Malcolm was not grateful. "It's not possible," returned Malcolm. "I saw him last night." "He came about 10 o'clock, sir, and had a turn of the fallen sickness on the spot. He's very ill, the know, and the mistress sent me o'er to speir gin you would oblige her by gaein to see him." "Has he ta'en till his bed?" asked Malcolm. "We pet him till it, sir. He's raving mad, and I'm thinking he's not far frae his hinner end." "I'll gang wi' you directly," said Malcolm. In a few minutes they were riding fast along the road to Kirkbyres, neither with much to say to the other, for Malcolm distrusted everyone about the place, and Tom was by nature taciturn. "What garred them send for me, do ye ken?" asked Malcolm at length, when they had gone about half-way. "He cried out upon ye in the night," answered Tom. When they arrived, Malcolm was shown into the drawing-room, where Mrs. Stewart met him with red eyes. "Will you come and see my poor boy?" she said. "I will do that, mem. Is he very ill?" "Very. I'm afraid he is in a bad way." She led him to a dark, old-fashioned chamber, rich and gloomy. There, sunk in the down of a huge bed with carved ebony posts, lay the laird, far too ill to be incommoded by the luxury to which he was unaccustomed. His head kept tossing from side to side, and his eyes seemed searching in vacancy. "Has the doctor been to see him, mem?" asked Malcolm. "Yes, but he says he can't do anything for him." "Who waits upon him, mem?" "One of the maids and myself." "I'll just bide with him." "That will be very kind of you." "I s' bide wi' him till I see him out o' this, one way or other," added Malcolm, and sat down by the bedside of his poor distrustful friend. There Mrs. Stewart left him. The laird was wandering in the thorny thickets and slimy marshes which, haunted by the thousand misshapen horrors of delirium, beset the gates of life. That one so near the light and slowly drifting into it should lie tossing in hopeless darkness. Is it that the delirium falls a veil of love to hide other and more real terrors? His eyes would now and then meet those of Malcolm as they gazed tenderly upon him. But the living thing that looked out of the windows was darkened and saw him not. Occasionally a word would fall from him, or a murmur of half-articulation float up, like the sound of a river of souls. But whether Malcolm heard, or only seemed to hear, something like this, he could not tell, for he could not be certain that he had not himself shaped the words by receiving the babble into the moulds of the laird's customary thought and speech. "I dinna ken where I come frae. I kenna where I'm gaen till. Gin he would but come out and show himsel'. Oh Lord, take the divil off of my poor back. Oh Father o' Lights, gar and take the hump with him. I hae no favour for it, though it's been my constant companion this many a lang." But in general he only moaned, and after the words thus heard or fashioned by Malcolm, lay silent and nearly still for an hour. All the waning afternoon Malcolm sat by his side, and neither mother, maid, nor doctor came near them. "Dark walls and not a breath," he murmured, or seemed to murmur again. "Na girse, nor flowers, nor bees. I hae no room for my hump, and I cannot lie upon it, for that would kill me. Will I ever ken where I cam frae? The wine's unco good. Gie me a drap mair, gin ye please, Lady Horne. I thought the grave was a better place. I lain softer afore I died. Feemy! Feemy! Rin, Feemy, rin! I bide with him this time. Ye run, Feemy!" As it grew dark, the air turned very chill, and snow began to fall thick and fast. Malcolm laid a few sticks on the smouldering peat fire, but they were damp and did not catch. All at once the laird gave a shriek, and crying out, "Mither! Mither!" fell into a fit so violent that the heavy bed shook with his convulsions. Malcolm held his wrists and called aloud. No one came, and bethinking himself that none could help, he waited in silence for what would follow. The fit passed quickly, and he lay quiet. The sticks had meantime dried, and suddenly they caught fire and blazed up. The laird turned his face towards the flame. A smile came over it. His eyes opened wide, and with such an expression of seeing gazed beyond Malcolm that he turned his in the same direction. The bonny man," murmured the laird. But Malcolm saw nothing, and turned again to the laird. His jaw had fallen, and the light was fading out of his face like the last of a sunset. He was dead. Malcolm rang the bell, told the woman who answered it what had taken place, and hurried from the house, glad at heart that his friend was at rest. He had ridden but a short distance when he was overtaken by a boy on a fast pony, who pulled up as he neared him. "Where are you for?" asked Malcolm. "I'm gaun for Mistress Catanagh," answered the boy. "Gang your ways, then, and dinna hold the dead waiting," said Malcolm with a shudder. The boy cast a look of dismay behind him, and galloped off. The snow still fell, and the night was dark. Malcolm spent nearly 2 hours on the way, and met the boy returning, who told him that Mrs. Catanagh was not to be found. His road lay down the glen, past Duncan's cottage, at whose door he dismounted, but he did not find him. Taking the bridle on his arm, he walked by his horse the rest of the way. It was about 9 o'clock, and the night very dark. As he neared the house, he heard Duncan's voice. "Malcolm, my son, will it be your own self?" it said. "It will that, Daddy," answered Malcolm. The piper was sitting on a fallen tree, with the snow settling softly upon him. "But it's ower cold for you to be sitting there in the snow, and the mirk too," added Malcolm. "The darkness will not be getting to the inside of her," returned the seer. "Ah, my boy, where the light gets in, the darkness will be getting in too. 'Tis no, your whole body will be full of darkness, as the Bible will say, and Duncan's body, that will be full of the light." Then with suddenly changed tone he said, "Listen, Malcolm, my son, she'll be very uneasy till you was become home." "What's the matter now, Daddy?" returned Malcolm. "Anything wrong about the house?"
Something will be wrong, yes, but she'll not can tell where. No, her body will not be full of light. For down here in the cursed lowlands, the sight has been almost gone from her, my son. It will now be no more as a coe creeping through her, and she'll never see plain no more, till she be gone back to her own mountains."
"The poor laird's gane back to his," said Malcolm. "I wonder gin he kens yet, or gin he gangs speerin' at ilk ane he meets gin he can tell him where he cam frae. He's mad nae mair, ony gait."
"How? Will he be not dead? The poor laird, the poor mad laird."
"Aye, he's dead. Maybe that's what'll be troublin' your sight, Daddy."
"No, my son. The mad laird was not very mad, and if he was mad he was not bad, and it was not to the blame of him. He was good always, however."
"He was that, Daddy."
"But it will be something very bad, and it will be troubling her spirit. When she'll be take the pipes to be amusing herself, and will blow till an cra a ganacha."
"Turn the cows, Duncan."
"O't will become cua un ir vuir."
"The lament of the big man."
"All is not well, my son."
"Weel, dinna distress yoursel, Daddy. Lat come what will come. Foreseeing's no forefending. Ye ken yoursel 'at mony's the time the seer has broke the thing on by trying to hold it off."
"It will be true, my son, but it would always have come."
"Nae doubt. So ye just come in wi' me, Daddy, and sit down by the ha fire, and I'll come to ye as soon as I've been up to see 'at the mester disna want me. But ye'll better come up with me to my room first," he went on, "for the maester disna like to see me in anything but the kilt."
"And why will he not be into kilts all as now?"
"I hae been riding, ye ken, Daddy, and the trews fits the saddle better nor the kilts."
"She'll not be knowing that. Old Alister, your great, her own grandfather, was the best horseman the world ever saw, and he'll never be having the trews to his own legs, nor the saddle to his horse's back. He'll just make his men be strap on an old plaid, and he'll be give a jump, and away they was, horse and man, one beast, all two of them both together."
Thus chatting, they went to the stable, and from the stable to the house, where they met no one, and went straight up to Malcolm's room, the old man making as little of the long ascent as Malcolm himself. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 66. The Cry from the Chamber. Brooding, if a man of his temperament may ever be said to brood, over the sad history of his young wife and the prospects of his daughter, the Marquis rode over fields and through gates. He had never been one to jump a fence in cold blood, till the darkness began to fall, and the bearings of his perplexed position came plainly before him. First of all, Malcolm acknowledged, and the date of his mother's death known, what would Florimel be in the eyes of the world? Supposing the world deceived by the statement that his mother died when he was born, where yet was the future he had marked out for her? He had no money to leave her, and she must be helplessly dependent on her brother. Malcolm, on the other hand, might make a good match, or, with the advantages he could secure him, in the army, still better in the navy, well enough push his way in the world. Miss Horne could produce no testimony, and Mrs. Cattenaugh had asserted him the son of Mrs. Stewart. He had seen enough, however, to make him dread certain possible results if Malcolm were acknowledged as the Laird of Kirkbyres. No, there was but one hopeful measure, one which he had even already approached in a tentative way, an appeal, namely, to Malcolm himself, in which, acknowledging his probable rights, but representing in the strongest manner the difficulty of proving them, he would set forth, in their full dismay, the consequences to Florimel of their public recognition, and offer, upon the pledge of his word to a certain line of conduct, to start him in any path he chose to follow. Having thought the thing out pretty thoroughly, as he fancied, and resolved at the same time to feel his way toward negotiations with Mrs. Cattenaugh, he turned and rode home. After a tolerable dinner, he was sitting over a bottle of the port which he prized beyond anything else his succession had brought him, when the door of the dining-room opened suddenly, and the butler appeared, pale with terror. "My lord, my lord," he stammered, as he closed the door behind him. "Well, what the devil's the matter now? Whose cow's dead?" "Your lordship didn't hear it, then?" faltered the butler. "You've been drinking, Bings," said the Marquis, lifting his 7th glass of port. "I didn't say I heard it, my lord." "Heard what, in the name of Beelzebub?" "The ghost, my lord." "The what?" shouted the Marquis. "That's what they call it, my lord. It's all along of having that wizard's chamber in the house, my lord." "You're a set of fools," said the Marquis. "The whole kit of you." "That's what I say, my lord. I don't know what to do with them, starricking and screaming. Mrs. Courthope is trying her best with them, but it's my belief she's about as bad herself." The Marquis finished his glass of wine, poured out and drank another, then walked to the door. When the butler opened it, a strange sight met his eyes. All the servants in the house, men and women, Duncan and Malcolm alone excepted, had crowded after the butler, every one afraid of being left behind, and there gleamed the crowd of ghastly faces in the light of the great hall fire. Demon stood in front, his mane bristling, and his eyes flaming. Such was the silence that the Marquis heard the low howl of the waking wind, and the snow like the patting of soft hands against the windows. He stood for a moment, more than half enjoying their terror, when from somewhere in the building a far-off shriek, shrill and piercing, rang in every ear. Some of the men drew in their breath with a gasping sob, but most of the women screamed outright, and that set the Marquis cursing. Duncan and Malcolm had but just entered the bedroom of the latter, when the shriek rent the air close beside, and for a moment deafened them. So agonized, so shrill, so full of dismal terror was it, that Malcolm stood aghast, and Duncan started to his feet with responsive outcry. But Malcolm at once recovered himself. "Bide here till I come back," he whispered, and hurried noiselessly out. In a few minutes he returned, during which all had been still. "No, Daddy," he said, "I'm going to drive in the door of the next room. There's some devilry at work there. Stand ye in the door, and ghost or devil that would win by ye, grip it and hold on like Damon the dog." "She will so, muttered Duncan in a strange tone. "Ochone, that she'll not be having her dirk with her. Ochone. Malcolm took the key of the wizard's chamber from his chest, and his candle from the table, which he set down in the passage. In a moment he had unlocked the door, put his shoulder to it, and burst it open. A light was extinguished, and a shapeless figure went gliding away through the gloom. It was no shadow, however, for dashing itself against a door at the other side of the chamber, it staggered back with an imprecation of fury and fear, pressed 2 hands to its head, and turning at bay, revealed the face of Mrs. Catanagh. In the door stood the blind piper with outstretched arms, and hands ready to clutch, the fingers curved like claws, his knees and haunches bent, leaning forward like a rampant beast prepared to spring. In his face was wrath, hatred, vengeance, disgust, an enmity of all mingled kinds. Malcolm was busied with something in the bed, and when she turned, Mrs. Catanagh saw only the white face of hatred gleaming through the darkness. "Ye old donner devil!" she cried, with an addition too coarse to be set down, and threw herself upon him. The old man said never a word, but with indrawn breath hissing through his clenched teeth, clutched her, and down they went together in the passage, the piper undermost. He had her by the throat, it is true, but she had her fingers in his eyes, and kneeling on his chest, kept him down with a vigour of hostile effort that drew the very picture of murder. It lasted but a moment, however, for the old man, spurred by torture as well as hate, gathered what survived of a most sinewy strength into one huge heave, threw her back into the room, and rose, with the blood streaming from his eyes, just as the Marquis came round the near end of the passage, followed by Mrs. Courthope, the butler, Stoat, and 2 of the footmen. Heartily enjoying a row, he stopped instantly, and signing a halt to his followers, stood listening to the mud geyser that now burst from Mrs. Catanagh's throat. "Ye blind abortion of Satan's soul," she cried, "didna I take ye to do with ye as I liked, and that devil's tripe ye call your own ye? He, him your grandson. He's nothing but one of your hated camels." "A chonga a deal weir,
that duag dane of bread."
"O tongue of the great devil, thou art making a lie," screamed Duncan, speaking for the first time.
"God lay me dead in my sins gin he be anything but a bastard camel,"
she asseverated, with a laugh of demoniacal scorn.
"Your doted Malcolm's nothing but the dykeside brat of the late Grizel camel, 'at the folk took for a saint 'cause she gret and said nothing. I laid the cummel pup in your body arms with my ain hands, upon the top of your cursed scraggin bagpipes that so often driv the sleep frae my ain. Na, ye would none o' me. But I gie ye a camel bairn to your heart for all that, ye old hunger waver-legged worm-eaten idiot."
A torrent of Gaelic broke from Duncan, into the midst of which rushed another from Mrs. Cattenaugh, similar, but coarse in vowel and harsh in consonant sounds. The Marquis stepped into the room. "What is the meaning of all this?" he said with dignity. The tumult of Celtic altercation ceased. The piper drew himself up to his full height and stood silent. Mrs. Cattenaugh, red as fire with exertion and wrath, turned ashy pale. The Marquis cast on her a searching and significant look.
"See here, my lord," said Malcolm.
Candle in hand, his lordship approached the bed. The same moment Mrs. Cattenaugh glided out, with her usual downy step, gave a wink as of mutual intelligence to the group at the door, and vanished. On Malcolm's arm lay the head of a young girl. Her thin, worn countenance was stained with tears, and livid with suffocation. She was recovering, but her eyes rolled stupid and visionless.
"It's Feemy, my lord. Blue Peter's lassie it was tint," said Malcolm.
"It begins to look serious," said the Marquis. "Mrs. Cattenaugh! Mrs. Courthope!" He turned towards the door. Mrs. Courthope entered, and a head or two peeped in after her. Duncan stood as before, drawn up and stately, his visage working, but his body motionless as the statue of a sentinel. "Where is the Cattenaugh woman gone?" cried the Marquis.
"Gone!" shouted the piper. "Gone! And her husband will be waiting to be killing her. Och nan, ochan."
"Her husband?" echoed the Marquis.
"Ach, she'll not can be helping it, my lord. No more till one will be dead. And that should be the woman, for she'll be a bad woman, the worstest woman ever was married, my lord."
"That's saying a good deal," returned the Marquis.
"Not one word more is enough, my lord," said Duncan. "She was only be her next wife, but ochone, why did she'll be marry her? You would have stabbed her long ago, my lord, if she was your wife, and you was knowing the damned fox and badger she was be. Ochone, and she didn't be have her dirk at her hench, nor her skein and her hose."
He shook his hands like a despairing child, then stamped and wept in the agony of frustrated rage. Mrs. Courthope took Feemy in her arms, and carried her to her own room, where she opened the window, and let the snowy wind blow full upon her. As soon as she came quite to herself, Malcolm set out to bear the good tidings to her father and mother. Only a few nights before had Feemy been taken to the room where they found her. She had been carried from place to place, and had been some time, she believed, in Mrs. Cattenaugh's own house. They had always kept her in the dark, and removed her at night, blindfolded. When asked if she had never cried out before, she said she had been too frightened, and when questioned as to what had made her do so then, she knew nothing of it. She remembered only that a horrible creature appeared by the bedside, after which all was blank. On the floor they found a hideous death mask, doubtless the cause of the screams which Mrs. Cattenaugh had sought to stifle with the pillows and bedclothes. When Malcolm returned, he went at once to the piper's cottage, where he found him in bed, utterly exhausted, and as utterly restless.
"Weel, Daddy," he said, "I doubt I dare not come near you now."
"Come to her arms, my poor boy," faltered Duncan. "She'll be sorry in her sore heart for her boy. Never you be minding, my son. You couldn't help the common mother, and you'll be her own boy, however. Ochone, it will be a plot upon you all your days, my son, and she'll not can help you, and it'll be breaking her old heart."
"Gin God thought the camels worth making, Daddy, I dinna see 'at I hae ony right to complain 'at I came o' them."
"She hopes you'll be forgiven the blind old man, however. She couldn't see. or she would have known at once better."
"I dinna ken what ye're after now, Daddy," said Malcolm.
"That she'll do you a great wrong, and she'll be very sorry for it, my son."
"What wrong did ye ever do me, Daddy?"
"That she was let you grow up a camel, my boy. If she did but know the bad blood was be in you, she wouldn't be done you the wrong as bring you up."
"That's a wrong no ill to forgive, Daddy. But it's a pity you didn't let me lie, for maybe syne Mistress Catanagh would have brought me up hersel, and I might have come to something."
"The divil more would be in your heart and brain and bosom, my son."
"Well, ye see what ye saved me frae."
"Yes, but the devil will be to pay, for she couldn't save you from the camel blood, my boy.
Malcolm, my boy," he added after a pause, and with the solemnity of a mighty hate,
"the evil woman herself will be a camel. The woman Catanagh will be a camel, and her nane sell she'll not know it before she'll be into bed with the worsest camel that ever God made, and she begs his pardon, for she'll not believe he was making the camels."
"Divna you think God made me, Daddy?" asked Malcolm. The old man thought for a little.
"That will depend on who was be your father, my son," he replied. "If he too will be a camel, ochone, ochone. But there may be some good blood go into you, more as enough to say God will be make you, my son. But don't be asking, Malcolm. Don't you'll be asking."
"What am I not to ask, Daddy?"
"Don't be asking who made you. Who was the father to you, my boy? She would rather not be knowing, for the man might be a Campbell both. And if she couldn't be loving you no more, my son, she would be die before her time, and her days would be long in the land under the grass, my son."
But the memory of the sweet face, whose cold loveliness he had once kissed, was enough to outweigh with Malcolm all the prejudices of Duncan's installation, and he was proud to take up even her shame. To pass from Mrs. Stewart to her was to escape from the clutches of a vampire demon to the arms of a sweet mother angel. Deeply concerned for the newly discovered misfortunes of the old man, to whom he was indebted for this world's life at least, he anxiously sought to soothe him. But he had far more and far worse to torment him than Malcolm even yet knew, and with burning cheeks and bloodshot eyes he lay tossing from side to side, now uttering terrible curses in Gaelic, and now weeping bitterly. Malcolm took his loved pipes, and with the gentlest notes he could draw from them, tried to charm to rest the ruffled waters of his spirit. But his efforts were all in vain, and believing at length that he would be quieter without him, he went to the house and to his own room. The door of the adjoining chamber stood open, and the long forbidden room lay exposed to any eye. Little did Malcolm think, as he gazed around it, that it was the room in which he had first breathed the air of the world, in which his mother had wept over her own false position and his reported death, and from which he had been carried, by Duncan's wicked wife, down the ruinous stair, and away to the lip of the sea, to find a home in the arms of the man whom he had just left on his lonely couch, torn between the conflicting emotions of a gracious love for him and the frightful hate of her. End of chapter 66. Chapter 67 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 67. Feet of Wool. The next day, Miss Horne, punctual as fate, presented herself at Lossie House, and was shown at once into the Marquis's study, as it was called. When his lordship entered, she took the lead the moment the door was shut. "By this time, my lord, ye'll doubtless have made up your mind to do what's right," she said.
"That's what I have always wanted to do," returned the Marquis. Remarked Miss Horne, as plainly as inarticulately. "In this affair," he supplemented, adding, "it's not always so easy to tell what is right."
"It's no aye easy to look for it with baith your ain," said Miss Horne.
"This woman Catanagh, we must get her to give credible testimony. Whatever the fact may be, we must have strong evidence. And there comes the difficulty, that she has already made an altogether different statement. It gangs for nothing, my lord. It was never made afore a justice of the peace. I wish you would go to her and see how she is inclined. Me gang to Bobby Catna! Exclaimed Miss Horne. I would as soon gang in Kittle Sawton's nose with a pint of his tail. No, my lord. Can anybody gang till her with my wool, it's a be a limb of the law. I's had no cognostin with her. You would have no objection, however, to my seeing her, I presume, just to let her know that we have an inkling of the truth, said the Marquis. Now all this was the merest talk, for of course Miss Horne could not long remain in ignorance of the declaration Fury had, the night previous, forced from Mrs. Cadenaugh. But he must, he thought, put her off and keep her quiet, if possible, until he had come to an understanding with Malcolm, after which he would no doubt have his trouble with her. "You can do as your lordship likes," answered Miss Horne, "but I wouldna ha' it said o' me at I had any dealings with her. Who kens but she might say you tried to bribe her? There's nothing she would boggle at gin she thought it worth her while. No 'at I'm feared at her. Let her lay. I'm not so blut, but only dinna lippen till a word she says, my lord." The Marquis meditated. "I wonder whether the real source of my perplexity occurs to you, Miss Horne," he said at length. "You know I have a daughter." "Weel enough that, my lord." "By my second marriage." "Nae marriage of all, my lord." "True, if I confess to the first." "All the same, whether or no, my lord." "Then you see," the Marquis went on, refusing offence, "what the admission of your story would make of my daughter." "That's plain enough, my lord." Now, if I have read Malcolm right, he has too much regard for his mistress to put her in such a false position. "That is, my lord, ye would have your lawful son bear the lawless name." No, it need never come out what he is. I will provide for him, as a gentleman, of course." "It cannot be, my lord." "You can do nothing for him with that face o' his, but out comes the truth as to the father on. And it wouldna be long afore the tale was eked out with the name of his mither. Mistress Cadenaugh would see to that, gin 'twas only to spite me. And I wouldna have my Grizel called what she is not, for any lord's daughter in the 3 Cainricks." "What does it matter, now she's dead and gone?" said the Marquis, false to the dead in his love for the living. "Dead and gone, my lord? What call ye dead and gone? Maybe the great ones of the earth get sick of Forlithia grander at there for no more, and would perish like the brute beast. For anything I ken, they may hae their wuss, but for mysel', I would warstle to hold my soul wakin, in the very article o' death, for the bare chance o' seeing my bonny Grizel again. It's a mercy I had no feelings," she added, arresting her handkerchief on its way to her eyes, and refusing to acknowledge the single tear that ran down her cheek. Plainly, she was not like any of the women whose characters the Marquis had accepted as typical of womankind. "Then you won't leave the matter to her husband and son," he said reproachfully. "I tell't you, my lord, I would do nothing but what I saw to be right. Let this affair out of my hands I darena. That lad ye might work to anything 'at made again himsel'. He's just like his poor mither there." "If Miss Campbell was his mother," said the Marquis. "Miss Campbell!" cried Miss Horne. "I'll thank your lordship to call her by her ain, and that's Lady Lossie." What of the something ruinous heart of the Marquis was habitable was occupied by his daughter, and had no accommodation at present either for his dead wife or his living son. Once more he sat thinking in silence for a while. "I'll make Malcolm a post-captain in the navy, and give you 1,000 pounds," he said at length, hardly knowing that he spoke. Miss Horne rose to her full height, and stood like an angel of rebuke before him. Not a word did she speak, only looked at him for a moment, and turned to leave the room. The Marquis saw his danger, and striding to the door, stood with his back against it. "Think ye to scare me, my lord?" she asked, with a scornful laugh. "Gang and scare the stone lion beast at your hall door. Hold out o' the gate and let me gang." "Not until I know what you are going to do," said the Marquis, very seriously. "I hae nothing mair to transact with your lordship. You and me as strangers, my lord." "Tut, I was but trying you." "And gin I had ta'en the disgrace ye offered me, ye would ha' drawn back." "No, certainly." "Ye wasna trying me then. Ye was doing your best to corrupt me." "I'm no splitter of hairs." "My lord, it's none but the corruptible would seek to corrupt." The Marquis gnawed a nail or two in silence. Miss Horne dragged an easy chair within a couple of yards of him. "We'll see who tires of this game first, my lord," she said, as she sank into its hospitable embrace. The Marquis turned to lock the door, but there was no key in it. Neither was there any chair within reach, and he was not fond of standing. Clearly his enemy had the advantage. "Hae ye heard o' poor Sandy Graham? How they're misguiding him, my lord?" she asked with composure. The Marquis was first astounded, and then tickled by her assurance. "No," he answered. "They had turned him out of house and ha', school at least, and hame," she rejoined. "I may say they had turned him out of Scotland. For what presbytery would have him, after he had been found guilty o' no thinking like other folk? Ye maun stand his good friend, my lord." "He shall be Malcolm's tutor," answered the Marquis, not to be outdone in coolness, "and go with him to Edinburgh, or Oxford, if he prefers it." "Never the Earl o' Colonsay had it better," said Miss Horne. "Softly, softly, ma'am," returned the Marquis. "I did not say he should go in that style." "He's a gang as my lord o' Colonsay, or he's a no gang at your expense, my lord," said his antagonist. "Really, ma'am, one would think you were my grandmother to hear you order my affairs for me." "I wuss I were, my lord. I said gar ye hae reason upon baith sides o' your head, I se warrant." The Marquis laughed. "Well, I can't stand here all day," he said, impatiently swinging one leg. "I'm weel aware o' that, my lord," answered Miss Horne, rearranging her scanty skirt. "How long are you going to keep me, then?" "I wouldna hae ye bide a minute longer nor's agreeable to yoursel'. But I'm in nae hurry so long as ye're afore me. Ye're no ill to look at, though ye maun hae been bonnier the day ye won the heart o' my griselle." The Marquis uttered an oath and left the door. Miss Horne sprang to it, but there was the Marquis again. "Miss Horne," he said, "I beg you will give me another day to think of this." "Whaur's the use? All the thinking in the world canna alter a single fac'. Ye maun do right by my laddie o' your ain sel', or I maun gar ye." "You would find a lawsuit heavy, Miss Horne." "And ye would find the scandal o' it ill to bide, my lord. It would come sair upon Miss— I kenna what name she has a right till, my lord." The Marquis uttered a frightful imprecation, left the door, and sitting down, hid his face in his hands. Miss Horne rose, but instead of securing her retreat, approached him gently, and stood by his side. "My lord," she said, "I canna thole to see a man in trouble. Women's born till it, and they take it and are thankful. But a man never gives in till it, and so it comes harder upon him nor upon them. Hear me, my lord. Gien there be a man upon this earth who would shield a woman, that man's Malcolm Colonsay." "If only she weren't his sister," murmured the Marquis. "And just bethink ye, my lord, wad it be anything less nor an imposition to let a man marry her untell't him what she was?" "You insolent old woman!" cried the Marquis, losing his temper, discretion, and manners altogether. "Go and do your worst, and be damned to you." So saying, he left the room, and Miss Horne found her way out of the house in a temper quite as fierce as his, in character, however, entirely different, inasmuch as it was righteous. At that very moment Malcolm was in search of his master, and seeing the back of him disappear in the library, to which he had gone in a half-blind rage, he followed him. "My lord," he said. "What do you want?" returned his master in a rage. For some time he had been hauling on the curb-rein, which had fretted his temper the more, and when he let go, the devil ran away with him. "I thought your lordship would like to see an old stair I came upon the other day, at gangs frae the wizard's chamber." "Go to hell with your damned tomfoolery," said the Marquis. "If ever you mention that cursed hole again, I'll kick you out of the house." Malcolm's eyes flashed, and a fierce answer rose to his lips, but he had seen that his master was in trouble, and sympathy supplanted rage. He turned and left the room in silence. Lord Lossie paced up and down the library for a whole hour, a long time for him to be in one mood. The mood changed colour pretty frequently during the hour, however, and by degrees his wrath assuaged. But at the end of it, he knew no more what he was going to do than when he left Miss Horne in the study. Then came the gnawing of his usual ennui and restlessness. He must find something to do. The thing he always thought of first was a ride, but the only animal of horse kind about the place which he liked was the bay mare, and her he had lamed. He would go and see what the rascal had come bothering about. Alone, though, for he could not endure the sight of the fisher fellow, damn him. In a few moments he stood in the wizard's chamber, and glanced round it with a feeling of discomfort rather than sorrow. of annoyance at the trouble of which it had been for him both fountain and storehouse, rather than regret for the agony and contempt which his selfishness had brought upon the woman he loved. Then, spying the door in the furthest corner, he made for it, and in a moment more, his curiosity, now thoroughly roused, was slowly gyrating down the steps of the old screw-stair. But Malcolm had gone to his own room, and hearing someone in the next, half suspected who it was, and went in. Seeing the closet door open, he hurried to the stair, and shouted, my lord, or whoever ye are, take care how ye gang, or ye'll get a terrible fall." Down a single yard the stair was quite dark, and he dared not follow fast, for fear of himself falling and occasioning the accident he feared. As he descended, he kept repeating his warnings, but either his master did not hear or heeded too little, for presently Malcolm heard a rush, a dull fall, and a groan. Hurrying as fast as he dared with the risk of falling upon him, he found the Marquis lying amongst the stones in the ground entrance, apparently unable to move, and white with pain. Presently, however, he got up, swore a good deal, and limped, swearing, into the house. The doctor, who was sent for instantly, pronounced the kneecap injured, and applied leeches. Inflammation set in, and another doctor and surgeon were sent for from Aberdeen. They came, applied poultices and again leeches, and enjoined the strictest repose. The pain was severe, but to one of the Marquis's temperament, the enforced quiet was worse. End of chapter 67. Chapter 68 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 68. Hands of Iron. The Marquis was loved by his domestics, and his accident, with its consequences, although none more serious were anticipated, cast a gloom over Lossie House. Far apart as was his chamber from all the centres of domestic life, the pulses of his suffering beat as it were through the house, and the servants moved with hushed voice and gentle footfall. Outside, the course of events waited upon his recovery, for Miss Horne was too generous not to delay proceedings while her adversary was ill. Besides, what she most of all desired was the Marquis's free acknowledgment of his son, and after such a time of suffering and constrained reflection as he was now passing through, he could hardly fail, she thought, to be more inclined to what was just and fair. Malcolm had of course hastened to the schoolmaster with the joy of his deliverance from Mrs. Stewart, but Mr. Graham had not acquainted him with the discovery Miss Horne had made, or her belief concerning his large interest therein, to which Malcolm's report of the wrath-born declaration of Mrs. Catanagh had now supplied the only testimony wanting, for the right of disclosure was Miss Horne's. To her he had carried Malcolm's narrative of late events, tenfold strengthening her position, but she was anxious in her turn that the revelation concerning his birth should come to him from his father. Hence Malcolm continued in ignorance of the strange dawn that had begun to break on the darkness of his origin. Miss Horne had told Mr. Graham what the Marquis had said about the tutorship, but the schoolmaster only shook his head with a smile, and went on with his preparations for departure. The hours went by, the days lengthened into weeks, and the Marquis's condition did not improve. He had never known sickness and pain before, and like most of the children of this world, counted them the greatest of evils. Nor was there any sign of their having as yet begun to open his eyes to what those who have seen them call truths, those who have never even boded their presence count absurdities. More and more, however, he desired the attendance of Malcolm, who was consequently a great deal about him, serving with a love to account for which those who knew his nature would not have found it necessary to fall back on the instinct of the relation between them. The Marquis had soon satisfied himself that that relation was as yet unknown to him, and was all the better pleased with his devotion and tenderness. The inflammation continued, increased, spread, and at length the doctors determined to amputate. But the Marquis was absolutely horrified at the idea, shrank from it with invincible repugnance. The moment the first dawn of comprehension vaguely illuminated their periphrastic approaches, he blazed out in a fury, cursed them frightfully, called them all the contemptuous names in his rather limited vocabulary, and swore he would see them uncomfortable first. "We fear mortification, my lord," said the physician calmly. "So do I. Keep it off," returned the Marquis. "We fear we cannot, my lord." It had, in fact, already commenced. "Let it mortify, then, and be damned," said his lordship. "I trust, my lord, you will reconsider it," said the surgeon. "We should not have dreamed of suggesting a measure of such severity, had we not had reason to dread that the further prosecution of gentler means would but lessen your lordship's chance of recovery." "You mean, then, that my life is in danger?" "We fear," said the physician, "that the amputation proposed is the only thing that can save it." "What a brace of blasted bunglers you are!" cried the Marquis, and turning away his face, lay silent. The two men looked at each other and said nothing. Malcolm was by, and a keen pang shot to his heart at the verdict. The men retired to consult. Malcolm approached the bed. "My lord," he said gently. No reply came. "Dinna leave us our loans, my lord." "No yet," Malcolm persisted. "What's to come o' my lady?" The Marquis gave a gasp. Still he made no reply. "She has nobody, ye ken, my lord, that ye would like to lippen her with." "You must take care of her when I am gone, Malcolm," murmured the Marquis, and his voice was now gentle with sadness and broken with misery. "Me, my lord," returned Malcolm. "Who would mind me? And what could I do with her? I couldna even hold her on watter feet. Her lady's maid could do mair with her, though I would lay down my life for her, as I told ye, my lord, and she kens it weel enough." Silence followed. Both men were thinking. "Gie me a right, my lord, and I'll do my best," said Malcolm, at length breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" growled the Marquis, whose mood had altered. "Give me a legal right, my lord, and see gin I dinna." "See what?" "See gin I dinna look weel after my lady." "How am I to see? I shall be dead and damned." "Please God, my lord, ye'll be alive and weel. In a better place, if not here, to look after my lady yoursel." "Oh, I dare say," muttered the Marquis. "But ye'll hearken to the doctors, my lord," Malcolm went on, "and no day wantin' time to consider o' it." "Yes, yes. To-morrow I'll have another talk with them, and we'll see about it. There's time enough yet. They're all coxcombs, every one of them. They never give a patient the least credit for common sense." "I dinna ken, my lord," said Malcolm doubtfully. After a few minutes' silence, during which Malcolm thought he had fallen asleep, the Marquis resumed abruptly. "What do you mean by giving you a legal right?" he said. "There's some way o' making a body guardian till another, so 'at the law'll uphaud him. Isna there, my lord?" "Yes, surely." "Well, rather odd, wouldn't it be? A young fisher lad, guardian to a marchioness, eh? They say there's nothing new under the sun, but that sounds rather like it, I think." Malcolm was overjoyed to hear him speak with something like his old manner. He felt he could stand any amount of chaff from him now, and so the proposition he had made in seriousness he went on to defend in the hope of giving amusement, yet with a secret wild delight in the dream of such full devotion to the service of Lady Florimell. "It would sound queer enough, my lord, no doubt, but folk maunna mind the sound o' a thing gin it be all straight and fair, and strong enough to stand. They couldna lock me out o' my rights, be they 'at they liked, Lady Belair or any o' them. Na, nor jaw me out o' them either." "They might do a good deal to render those rights of little use," said the Marquis. "That would come till a trial o' brains, my lord," returned Malcolm, "and ye dinna think I would hae the wit to speir advice, and what's mair, to ken when it was good, and take it. There's lawyers, my lord." "And their expenses?" "Ye could leave some muckle to be wared upon the carryin' out o' your lordship's wull." "Who would see that you applied it properly?" "My ain conscience, my lord, or Maister Graham, gin ye liked." "And how would you live yourself?" "Oh, leave ye that to me, my lord. Only dinna imagine I would be beholden to your lordship. I hope I hae mair pride nor that. Ilka pound note, shillin' and bawbee sud be laid out for her, and what was left, hain it for her. Saved." "By Jove, it's a daring proposal," said the Marquis, and, which seemed strange to Malcolm, not a single thread of ridicule ran through the tone in which he made the remark. The next day came, but brought neither strength of body nor of mind with it. Again his professional attendants besought him, and he heard them more quietly, but rejected their proposition as positively as before. In a day or two he ceased to oppose it, but would not hear of preparation. Hour glided into hour, and days had gathered to a week, when they assailed him with a solemn and last appeal. "Nonsense," answered the Marquis. "My leg is getting better. I feel no pain. In fact, nothing but a little faintness. Your damned medicines, I haven't a doubt." "You are in the greatest danger, my lord. It is all but too late, even now." "Tomorrow, then, if it must be. Today I could not endure to have my hair cut, positively. And as to having my leg off, the thing's preposterous." He turned white and shuddered, for all the nonchalance of his speech. When tomorrow came, there was not a surgeon in the land who would have taken his leg off. He looked in their faces, and seemed for the first time convinced of the necessity of the measure. "You may do as you please," he said. "I am ready." "Not today, my lord," replied the doctor. "Your lordship is not equal to it today." "I understand," said the Marquis, paled frightfully, and turned his head aside. When Mrs. Courthope suggested that Lady Florimell should be sent for, he flew into a frightful rage, and spoke as it is to be hoped he had never spoken to a woman before. She took it with perfect gentleness, but could not repress a tear. The Marquis saw it, and his heart was touched. "You mustn't mind a dying man's temper," he said. "It's not for myself, my lord," she answered. "I know. You think I'm not fit to die, and damn it, you are right. Never one was less fit for heaven, or less willing to go to hell." "Wouldn't you like to see a clergyman, my lord?" she suggested, sobbing. He was on the point of breaking out in a still worse passion, but controlled himself. "A clergyman," he cried. "I would as soon see the undertaker. What could he do but tell me I was going to be damned, a fact I know better than he can? That is, if it's not all an invention of the cloth, as, in my soul, I believe it is. I've said so any time this 40 years. "Oh, my lord, do not fling away your last hope." "You imagine me to have a chance, then? Good soul, you don't know better." "The Lord is merciful." The Marquis laughed. That is, he tried, failed, and grinned. "Mr. Cairns is in the dining-room, my lord." "Bah! A low pettifogger with the soul of a bullock. Don't let me hear the fellow's name. I've been bad enough, God knows, but I haven't sunk to the level of his help yet. If he's God Almighty's factor and the saw holds, like master, like man, well, I would rather have nothing to do with either." "That is, if you had the choice, my lord," said Mrs. Courthope, her temper yielding a little, though in truth his speech was not half so irreverent as it seemed to her. "Tell him to go to hell. No, don't. Set him down to a bottle of port and a great sponge cake, and you needn't tell him to go to heaven, for he'll be there already. Why, Mrs. Courthope, the fellow isn't a gentleman, and yet all he cares for the cloth is that he thinks it makes a gentleman of him, as if anything in heaven, earth, or hell could work that miracle." In the middle of the night, as Malcolm sat by his bed, thinking him asleep, the Marquis spoke suddenly. "You must go to Aberdeen tomorrow, Malcolm," he said. "Vera weel, my lord." "And bring Mr. Glennie the lawyer back with you." "Yes, my lord." "Go to bed, then." "I would rather bide, my lord. I couldna sleep a wink for wanting to be back aside ye." The Marquis yielded, and Malcolm sat by him all the night through. He tossed about, would doze off and murmur strangely, then wake up and ask for brandy and water, yet be content with the lemonade Malcolm gave him. Next day he quarrelled with every word Mrs. Courthope uttered, kept forgetting he had sent Malcolm away, and was continually wanting him. His fits of pain were more severe, alternated with drowsiness, which deepened at times to stupor. It was late before Malcolm returned. He went instantly to his bedside. "Is Mr. Glennie with you?" asked his master feebly. "Yes, my lord." "Tell him to come here at once."
When Malcolm returned with the lawyer, the Marquis directed him to set a table and chair by the bedside, light 4 candles, get everything necessary for writing, and go to bed. End of chapter 68. Chapter 69 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 69. The Marquis and the Schoolmaster. Before Malcolm was awake, his lordship had sent for him. When he re-entered the sick chamber, Mr. Glennie had vanished, the table had been removed, and instead of the radiance of the wax lights, the cold gleam of a vapour-dimmed sun, with its sickly blue-white reflex from the wide-spread snow, filled the room. The Marquis looked ghastly, but was sipping chocolate with a spoon. "What way are you the day, my lord?" asked Malcolm. "Nearly well," he answered, "but those cursed carrion crows are set upon killing me. Damn their souls." "We'll hae Lady Florimel swearing awful gin ye gang on that gait, my lord," said Malcolm. The Marquis laughed feebly. "And what's mair," Malcolm continued, "I doubt there's some particular about the turn of their phrases up yonder, my lord." The Marquis looked at him keenly. "You don't anticipate that inconvenience for me," he said. "I'm pretty sure to have my billet where they're not so precise." "Dinna break my heart, my lord," cried Malcolm, the tears rushing to his eyes. "I should be sorry to hurt you, Malcolm," rejoined the Marquis gently, almost tenderly. "I won't go there if I can help it. I shouldn't like to break any more hearts. But how the devil am I to keep out of it? Besides, there are people up there I don't want to meet. I have no fancy for being made ashamed of myself. The fact is, I'm not fit for such company, and I don't believe there is any such place. But if there be, I trust in God there isn't any other, or it will go badly with your poor master, Malcolm. It doesn't look like true, now does it? Only such a multitude of things I thought I had done with forever keep coming up and grinning at me. It nearly drives me mad, Malcolm, and I would fain die like a gentleman, with a cool bow and a sharp face about." "Wouldna ye have a word with somebody at kens, my lord?" said Malcolm, scarcely able to reply. "No," answered the Marquis fiercely. "That Cairns is a fool." "He's all that and mair, my lord. I dinna mean him. They're all fools together." "Oh, na, my lord. There's a heap o' them no muckle better, it may be. But there's good men and true among them, or the kirk would have been with Sodom and Gomorrah by this time. But it's not a minister I would have your lordship confer with." "Who then? Mrs. Courthope, eh?" "Oh, na, my lord. No Mistress Courthope. She's a good body, but she wouldna believe her ain een gin onybody called a minister said contrair to them." "Who the devil do you mean, then?" "Na devil, but an honest man 'at's been his worst enemy so long as I hae kent him. Maister Graham, the schoolmaster." "Pooh," said the Marquis with a puff. "I'm too old to go to school." "I dinna ken the man 'at isn't a bairn till him, my lord." "In Greek and Latin?" "In righteousness and truth, my lord. In what's been and what is to be." "What, has he the second sight like the piper?" "He has the second sight, my lord, but one 'at gangs a sight farther than my old daddy's." "He could tell me then what's going to become of me?" "As weel as ony man, my lord." "That's not saying much, I fear." "Maybe mair nor ye think, my lord." "Well, take him my compliments, and tell him I should like to see him," said the Marquis after a pause. "He'll come directly, my lord." "Of course he will," said the Marquis. "Just as readily, my lord, as he would gang to any tramp 'at sent for him at sic a time," returned Malcolm, who did not relish either the remark or its tone. "What do you mean by that? You don't think it's such a serious affair, do you?" "My lord, ye hae not a chance." The Marquis was dumb. He had actually begun once more to buoy himself up with earthly hopes. Dreading a recall of his commission, Malcolm slipped from the room, sent Mrs. Courthope to take his place, and sped to the schoolmaster. The moment Mr. Graham heard the Marquis's message, he rose without a word, and led the way from the cottage. Hardly a sentence passed between them as they went, for they were on a solemn errand. "Mr. Graham's here, my lord," said Malcolm. "Where? Not in the room?" returned the Marquis. "Waiting at the door, my lord." "Bah, you needn't have been so ready. Have you told the sexton to get a new spade? But you may let him in, and leave him alone with me."
Mr. Graham walked gently up to the bedside. "Sit down, sir," said the Marquis courteously, pleased with the calm, self-possessed, unobtrusive bearing of the man. "They tell me I'm dying, Mr. Graham." "I'm sorry it seems to trouble you, my lord." "What, wouldn't it trouble you, then?" "I don't think so, my lord." "Ah, you're one of the elect, no doubt." "That's a thing I never did think about, my lord." "What do you think about, then?" "About God." "And when you die you'll go straight to heaven, of course." "I don't know, my lord. That's another thing I never trouble my head about." "Ah, you're like me, then. I don't care much about going to heaven. What do you care about?" "The will of God." "I hope your lordship will say the same." "No, I won't. I want my own will." "Well, that is to be had, my lord." "How?" "By taking his for yours as the better of the two, which it must be every way." "That's all moonshine." "It is light, my lord." "Well, I don't mind confessing, if I am to die I should prefer heaven to the other place. But I trust I have no chance of either. Do you now honestly believe there are two such places?" "I don't know, my lord." "You don't know? And you come here to comfort a dying man." "Your lordship must first tell me what you mean by two such places. And as to comfort, going by my notions, I cannot tell which you would be more or less comfortable in, and that, I presume, would be the main point with your lordship." "And what, pray, sir, would be the main point with you?" "To get nearer to God." "Well, I can't say I want to get nearer to God. It's little he's ever done for me." "It's a good deal he has tried to do for you, my lord." "Well, who interfered? Who stood in his way, then?" "Yourself, my lord." "I wasn't aware of it. When did he ever try to do anything for me and I stood in his way?" "When he gave you one of the loveliest of women, my lord," said Mr. Graham, with solemn, faltering voice, "and you left her to die in neglect, and the child to be brought up by strangers." The Marquis gave a cry. The unexpected answer had roused the slowly gnawing death and made it bite deeper. "What have you to do," he almost screamed, "with my affairs? It was for me to introduce what I chose of them, you presume." "Pardon me, my lord. You led me to what I was bound to say. Shall I leave you, my lord?" The Marquis made no answer. "God knows I loved her," he said after a while, with a sigh. "You loved her, my lord?" "I did, by God." "Love a woman like that, and come to this?" "Come to this? We must all come to this, I fancy, sooner or later. Come to what, in the name of Beelzebub?" "That, having loved a woman like her, you are content to lose her. In the name of God, have you no desire to see her again?" "It would be an awkward meeting," said the Marquis. His was an old love, alas. He had not been capable of the sort that defies change. It had faded from him until it seemed one of the things that are not. Although his being had once glowed in its light, he could now speak of a meeting as awkward. "Because you wronged her?" suggested the schoolmaster. "Because they lied to me, by God." "Which they dared not have done, had you not lied to them first." "Sir!" shouted the Marquis, with all the voice he had left. "Oh, God have mercy! I cannot punish the scoundrel." "The scoundrel is the man who lies, my lord." "Were I anywhere else?" "There would be no good in telling you the truth, my lord. You showed her to the world as a woman over whom you had prevailed, and not as the honest wife she was. What kind of a lie was that, my lord? Not a white one, surely." "You are a damned coward to speak so to a man who cannot even turn on his side to curse you for a base hound. You would not dare it, but that you know I cannot defend myself." "You are right, my lord. Your conduct is indefensible." "By heaven, if I could but get this cursed leg under me, I would throw you out of the window." "I shall go by the door, my lord. While you hold by your sins will hold by you. If you should want me again, I shall be at your lordship's command." He rose and left the room, but had not reached his cottage before Malcolm overtook him, with a second message from his master. He turned at once, saying only, "I expected it." "Mr. Graham," said the Marquis, looking ghastly, "you must have patience with a dying man. I was very rude to you, but I was in horrible pain. Don't mention it, my lord. It would be a poor friendship that gave way for a rough word. How can you call yourself my friend? I should be your friend, my lord, if it were only for your wife's sake. She died loving you. I want to send you to her, my lord. You will allow that, as a gentleman, you at least owe her an apology. By Jove, you are right, sir. Then you really and positively believe in the place they call heaven? My lord, I believe that those who open their hearts to the truth shall see the light on their friends' faces again, and be able to set right what was wrong between them. It's a week too late to talk of setting right. Go and tell her you are sorry, my lord. That will be enough to her. Ah, but there's more than her concerned. You are right, my lord. There is another, one who cannot be satisfied that the fairest works of his hands, or rather, the loveliest children of his heart, should be treated as you have treated women. But the deity you talk of— I beg your pardon, my lord. I talked of no deity. I talked of a living love that gave us birth and calls us his children. Your deity I know nothing of. Call him what you please. He won't be put off so easily. He won't be put off, one jot or one tittle. He will forgive anything, but he will pass nothing. Will your wife forgive you? She will, when I explain. Then why should you think the forgiveness of God, which created her forgiveness, should be less? Whether the Marquis could grasp the reasoning may be doubtful. Do you really suppose God cares whether a man comes to good or ill? If he did not, he could not be good himself. Then you don't think a good God would care to punish poor wretches like us? Your lordship has not been in the habit of regarding himself as a poor wretch. And remember, you can't call a child a poor wretch without insulting the father of it. That's quite another thing. But on the wrong side for your argument, seeing the relation between God and the poorest creature is infinitely closer than that between any father and his child. Then he can't be so hard on him as the parsons say. He will give him absolute justice, which is the only good thing. He will spare nothing to bring his children back to himself, their sole well-being. What would you do, my lord, if you saw your son strike a woman? Knock him down and horsewhip him. It was Mr. Graham who broke the silence that followed. Are you satisfied with yourself, my lord? No, by God. You would like to be better? I would. Then you are of the same mind with God? Yes, but I'm not a fool. It won't do to say I should like to be. I must be it, and that's not so easy. It's damned hard to be good. I would have a fight for it, but there's no time. How is a poor devil to get out of such an infernal scrape? Keep the commandments. Well, that's it, of course. But there's no time, I tell you. At least, so those cursed doctors will keep telling me. If there were but time to draw another breath, there would be time to begin. How am I to begin? Which am I to begin with? There is one commandment which includes all the rest. Which is that? To believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. That's cant. After 30 years' trial of it, it is to me the essence of wisdom. It has given me a peace which makes life or death all but indifferent to me, though I would choose the latter. What am I to believe about him, then? You are to believe in him, not about him. I don't understand. He is our Lord and Master, elder brother, King, Saviour, the divine man, the human God. To believe in him is to give ourselves up to him in obedience, to search out his will and do it. But there's no time, I tell you again, the Marquis almost shrieked. And I tell you there is all eternity to do it in. Take him for your master, and he will demand nothing of you which you are not able to perform. This is the open door to bliss. With your last breath you can cry to him, and he will hear you, as he heard the thief on the cross who cried to him dying beside him, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Today thou shalt be with me in paradise. It makes my heart swell to think of it, my lord. No cross-questioning of the poor fellow, no preaching to him. He just took him with him where he was going, to make a man of him. Well, you know something of my history. What would you have me do now? At once, I mean. What would the person you speak of have me do? "That is not for me to say, my lord."
"You could give me a hint."
"No. God is telling you himself. For me to presume to tell you would be to interfere with him. What he would have a man do, he lets him know in his mind." "But what if I had not made up my mind before the last came? Then I fear he would say to you, 'Depart from me, thou worker of iniquity.' That would be hard when another minute might have done it. If another minute would have done it, you would have had it." A paroxysm of pain followed, during which Mr. Graham silently left him. End of chapter 69. Chapter 70 of Malcolm by George MacDonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Devorah Allen. Chapter 70. End or beginning. When the fit was over, and he found Mr. Graham was gone, he asked Malcolm, who had resumed his watch, how long it would take Lady Florimel to come from Edinburgh. "Mr. Crathie left with 4 horses frae the Lossie Arms last night, my lord," said Malcolm. "But the roads are ill, and she winna be here afore sometime the morn." The Marquis stared aghast. They had sent for her without his orders. "What shall I do?" he murmured. "If once I look in her eyes, I shall be damned." "Malcolm." "Yes, my lord." "Is there a lawyer in Port Lossie?" "Yes, my lord. There's old Maister Carmichael." "He won't do. He was my brother's rascal." "Is there no one besides?" "Not in Port Lossie, my lord. There can be none nearer than Deaf Harbour, I doubt." "Take the chariot and bring him here directly. Tell them to put 4 horses too. Stokes can ride one." "I'll ride the other, my lord." "You'll do nothing of the kind. You are not used to the pole." "I can take the leader, my lord." "I tell you, you're to do nothing of the kind," cried the Marquis angrily. "You're to ride inside, and bring Mr. what's his name back with you." "Souter, my lord, gin you please." "Be off then. Don't wait to feed. The brutes have been eating all day, and they can eat all night. You must have him here in an hour." In an hour and a quarter, Miss Horne's friend stood by the Marquis's bedside. Malcolm was dismissed, but was presently summoned again to receive more orders. Fresh horses were put to the chariot, and he had to set out once more, this time to fetch a justice of the peace, a neighbour laird. The distance was greater than to Duff Harbour. The roads were worse. The north wind, rising as they went, blew against them as they returned, increasing to a violent gale, and it was late before they reached Lossie House. When Malcolm entered, he found the Marquis alone. "Is Morrison here at last?" he cried in a feeble, irritated voice. "Yes, my lord." "What the devil kept you so long? The bay mare would have carried me there and back in an hour and a half." "The roads were very heavy, my lord, and just here till the wind." The Marquis listened a moment, and a frightened expression grew over his thin, pale, anxious face. "You don't know what depends on it," he said, "or you would have driven better. Where is Mr. Souter?" "I dinna ken, my lord. I'm only just come, and I've seen nobody." "Go and tell Mrs. Courthope I want Souter. You'll find her crying somewhere, the old chicken, because I swore at her. What harm could that do the old goose?" "It'll be mair for love o' your lordship than fright at the swearing, my lord." "You think so? Why should she care? Go and tell her I'm sorry. But really she ought to be used to me by this time. Tell her to send Souter directly." Mr. Souter was not to be found, the fact being that he had gone to see Miss Horne. The Marquis flew into an awful rage, and began to curse and swear frightfully. My lord," said Malcolm, "for God's sake dinna gang on that gait. He canna like to hear that kind of speech, and frae one of his ain too." The Marquis stopped, aghast at his presumption, and choking with rage. But Malcolm's eyes filled with tears, and instead of breaking out again, his master turned his head away and was silent. Mr. Souter came. "Fetch Morrison," said the Marquis, "and go to bed." The wind howled terribly as Malcolm ascended the stairs and half felt his way, for he had no candle, through the long passages leading to his room. As he entered the last, a huge vague form came down upon him, like a deeper darkness through the dark. Instinctively he stepped aside.
It passed noiselessly, with a long stride, and not even a rustle of its garments. At least Malcolm heard nothing but the roar of the wind. He turned and followed it. On and on it went, down the stair through a corridor, down the great stone turnpike stair, and through passage after passage. When it came into the more frequented and half-lighted thoroughfares of the house, it showed as a large figure in a long cloak, indistinct in outline. It turned a corner close by the Marquis's room. But when Malcolm, close at its heels, turned also, he saw nothing but a vacant lobby, the doors around which were all shut. One after another he quickly opened them, all except the Marquis's, but nothing was to be seen. The conclusion was that it had entered the Marquis's room. He must not disturb the conclave in the sick chamber with what might be but a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain, and turned back to his own room, where he threw himself on his bed and fell asleep. About 12 Mrs. Courthope called him. His master was worse, and wanted to see him. The midnight was still, for the dark and wind had ceased. But a hush and a cloud seemed gathering in the stillness and darkness, and with them came the sense of a solemn celebration, as if the gloom were canopy as well as pall, black, but bordered and hearted with purple and gold, and the stillness seemed to tremble as with the inaudible tones of a great organ, at the close or commencement of some mighty symphony. With beating heart, he walked softly towards the room where, as on an altar, lay the vanishing form of his master, like the fuel in whose dying flame was offered the late and ill-nurtured sacrifice of his spirit. As he went through the last corridor leading thither, Mrs. Catanagh, type and embodiment of the horrors that haunt the dignity of death, came walking towards him like one at home, her great round body lightly upborne on her soft foot. It was no time to challenge her presence, and yielding her the half of the narrow way, he passed without a greeting. She dropped him a courtesy with an up-look, and again a veiling of her wicked eyes. The Marquis would not have the doctor come near him, and when Malcolm entered there was no one in the room but Mrs. Courthope. The shadow had crept far along the dial. His face had grown ghastly, the skin had sunk to the bones, and his eyes stood out as if from much staring into the dark. They rested very mournfully on Malcolm for a few moments, and then closed softly. "Is she come yet?" he murmured, opening them wide, with sudden stare. "No, my lord." The lids fell again, softly, slowly. "Be good to her, Malcolm," he murmured. "I will, my lord," said Malcolm solemnly. Then the eyes opened and looked at him. Something grew in them, a light as of love, and drew up after it a tear. But the lips said nothing. The eyelids fell again, and in a moment more Malcolm knew by his breathing that he slept. The slow night waned. He woke sometimes, but soon dozed off again. The two watched by him till the dawn. It brought a still grey morning, without a breath of wind, and warm for the season. The Marquis appeared a little revived, but was hardly able to speak. Mostly by signs he made Malcolm understand that he wanted Mr. Graham, but that someone else must go for him. Mrs. Courthope went. As soon as she was out of the room, he lifted his hand with effort, laid feeble hold on Malcolm's jacket, and drawing him down, kissed him on the forehead. Malcolm burst into tears, and sank weeping by the bedside. Mr. Graham entering a little after, and seeing Malcolm on his knees, knelt also, and broke into a prayer. "O blessed Father," he said, "who knowest this thing so strange to us which we call death, breathe more life into the heart of thy dying Son, that in the power of life he may front death. O Lord Christ, who diedst thyself, and in thyself knowest it all, heal this man in his sore need. Heal him with strength to die." Came a faint amen from the Marquis. "Thou didst send him into the world. Help him out of it. O God, we belong to thee utterly. We dying men are thy children, O living Father.
Thou art such a father that thou takest our sins from us, and throwest them behind thy back. Thou cleanest our souls, as thy Son did wash our feet. We hold our hearts up to thee. Make them what they must be, O love, O life of men, O heart of hearts. Give thy dying child courage, and hope, and peace. The peace of him who overcame all the terrors of humanity, even death itself, and liveth for evermore, sitting at thy right hand, our God-brother, blessed to all ages. Amen. Amen, murmured the Marquis, and slowly lifting his hand from the coverlid, he laid it on the head of Malcolm, who did not know it was the hand of his father, blessing him ere he died. Be good to her, said the Marquis once more. But Malcolm could not answer for weeping, and the Marquis was not satisfied. Gathering all his force, he said again, Be good to her. I will, burst from Malcolm in sobs, and he wailed aloud. The day wore on, and the afternoon came. Still Lady Florimel had not arrived, and still the Marquis lingered. As the gloom of the twilight was deepening into the early darkness of the winter night, he opened wide his eyes, and was evidently listening. Malcolm could hear nothing, but the light in his master's face grew, and the strain of his listening diminished. At length Malcolm became aware of the sound of wheels, which came rapidly nearer, till at last the carriage swung up to the hall door. A moment, and Lady Florimel was flitting across the room. "Papa! Papa!" she cried, and throwing her arm over him, laid her cheek to his. The Marquis could not return her embrace. He could only receive her into the depths of his shining, tearful eyes. "Flory," he murmured, "I'm going away. I've got to make an apology. Malcolm, be good." The sentence remained unfinished. The light paled from his countenance. He had to carry it with him. He was dead. Lady Florimel gave a loud cry. Mrs. Courthope ran to her assistance. "My lady's in a dead faint," she whispered, and left the room to get help. Malcolm lifted Lady Florimel in his great arms, and bore her tenderly to her own apartment. There he left her to the care of her women, and returned to the chamber of death. Meantime Mr. Graham and Mr. Souter had come. When Malcolm re-entered, the schoolmaster took him kindly by the arm, and said, "Malcolm, there can be neither place nor moment fitter for the solemn communication I am commissioned to make to you. I have, as in the presence of your dead father, to inform you that you are now Marquis of Lossie, and God forbid you should be less worthy as Marquis than you have been as fisherman." Malcolm stood stupefied. For a while he seemed to himself to be turning over in his mind something he had heard read from a book, with a nebulous notion of being somehow concerned in it. The thought of his father cleared his brain. He ran to the dead body, kissed its lips, as he had once kissed the forehead of another, and falling on his knees, wept, he knew not for what. Presently, however, he recovered himself, rose, and rejoining the two men, said, "Gentlemen, how many kens this turn of things?" "None but Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Catanagh, and ourselves, so far as I know," answered Mr. Souter. "And Miss Horne," added Mr. Graham. "She first brought out the truth of it, and ought to be the first to know of your recognition by your father." "I se tell her mysel'," returned Malcolm. "But, gentlemen, I beg o' ye, till I ken what I'm about and give ye leave, dinna open your mouth to living cratur about this. There's time enough for the world to ken it." "Your lordship commands me," said Mr. Souter. "Yes, Malcolm, until you give me leave," said Mr. Graham. "Where's Mr. Morrison?" asked Malcolm. "He is still in the house," said Mr. Souter. "Gang till him, sir, and gar him promise on the word of a gentleman to hold his tongue. I canna bide to have it blared all gate and all at once. For Mistress Catanagh, I se deal with her mysel'." The door opened, and in all the conscious dignity conferred by the immunities and prerogatives of her calling, Mrs. Catanagh walked into the room. "A word with you, Mistress Catanagh," said Malcolm. "Certainly, my lord," answered the howdy, with mingled presumption and respect, and followed him to the dining-room. "Well, my lord," she began, before he had turned from shutting the door behind them, in the tone and with the air, or rather airs, of having conferred a great benefit and expecting its recognition. "Mistress Catanagh," interrupted Malcolm, turning and facing her, "gin I be under any obligation to you, it's frae another tongue I maun hear it, but I hae an offer to make ye. So long as it disna come out that I'm anything better nor a fisherman born, ye s' hae your £20 in the year, paid ye quarterly. But the moment folks says who I am, ye touch not a pound not more, and I count myself free to pursue anything I can prove again ye." Mrs. Catanagh attempted a laugh of scorn, but her face was grey as putty, and its muscles declined response. "Aye or no," said Malcolm. "I winna gar ye swear, for I would lippen to your oath not a hair." "Aye, my lord," said the howdy, reassuming at least outward composure, and with it her natural brass, for as she spoke she held out her open palm. Na," said Malcolm, "na forehand payments. 3 months o' tongue-holding, and there's your £5, and Maister Suitor o' Duff Harbour'll pay it into your ain hand. But break troth with me, and ye s' hear o't, for gin ye were hanged the world would be but the cleaner. Now quit the house, and never let me see you about the place again. But afore ye gang, I gie ye fair warning 'at I mean to win at all your bygones." The blood of red wrath was seething in Mrs. Catanagh's face. She drew herself up and stood flaming before him, on the verge of explosion. "Gang frae the house," said Malcolm, "or I'll set the muckle hone to show ye the gate." Her face turned the colour of ashes, and with hanging cheeks and scared but not the less wicked eyes, she hurried from the room. Malcolm watched her out of the house, then following her into the town, brought Miss Horne back with him to aid in the last of earthly services, and hastened to Duncan's cottage. But to his amazement and distress it was forsaken, and the hearth cold. In his attendance on his father he had not seen the piper, he could not remember for how many days, and on inquiry he found that, although he had not been missed, no one could recall having seen him later than 3 or 4 days agone. The last he could hear of him in the neighbourhood was, that about a week before a boy had spied him sitting on a rock in the bailie's barn, with his pipes in his lap. Searching the cottage, he found that his broadsword and dirk, with all his poor finery, were gone. That same night Mrs. Catanagh also disappeared. A week after, what was left of Lord Lossie was buried. Malcolm followed the hearse with the household. Miss Horne walked immediately behind him, on the arm of the schoolmaster. It was a great funeral, with a short road, for the body was laid in the church, close to the wall, just under the crusader with the Norman canopy. Lady Florimel wept incessantly for 3 days. On the 4th, she looked out on the sea and thought it very dreary. On the 5th, she found a certain gratification in hearing herself called the Marchioness. On the 6th, she tried on her mourning, and was pleased. On the 7th, she went with the funeral, and wept again. On the 8th, came Lady Belair, who on the 9th carried her away. To Malcolm she had not spoken once. Mr. Graham left Portlossie. Miss Horne took to her bed for a week. Mr. Crathie removed his office to the house itself, took upon him the function of steward as well as factor, had the state-rooms dismantled, and was master of the place. Malcolm helped stoat with the horses and did odd jobs for Mr. Crathie. From his likeness to the old Marquis, as he was still called, the factor had a favour for him, firmly believing the said Marquis to be his father, and Mrs. Stewart his mother. Hence he allowed him a key to the library, of which Malcolm made good use. The story of Malcolm's plans, and what came of them, requires another book. End of chapter 70. End of Malcolm by George MacDonald.